Okay, welcome everyone to the second day of this information gathering session. The task being undertaken by this committee of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine is to assess potential causes, consequences, and remediation of plug failures. That's a broad overview. You can find the full statement of task for the committee using this link that I will put in the chat. And I'll also note that you can find committee biographies on this as well, upcoming events, prior events, and different materials that we post related to the committee's activities. I'd also like to give a sense of the format of today's meeting. So I'll go ahead and share the agenda for the day. Hopefully you all can see that. Is that okay? Great. Yeah, so overall, we'll have a couple of keynote speakers in the morning, a quicker session, about 45 minutes. And then following that, we'll go into our monitoring and remediation themed panel. We'll take a quick 30-minute break for lunch at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, and then reconvene for the final afternoon session at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. And then we'll wrap up at about 2 p.m. And if need be, if the conversation is lively, we can, adjust timing as needed, but we've got a pretty packed day today. So I think we can adjust perhaps the later session to extend it if need be, if there's interest in that. Okay, I'll go ahead and stop sharing for now. And we'll have our co-chair, Missy Feely, facilitate the morning sessions, and then our other co-chair, Jim Slutz, will moderate the afternoon session. And we've been having some internet difficulties, so that may change. We'll be rolling with the punches today, so bear with us. Okay, and then just a couple other items. This is an open session. The public is welcome to attend. You can use the Q&A function for audience members to submit questions and comments. Even if the committee doesn't, time permitting, get to these questions or comments, it's really helpful to have your perspectives on record. And then, yeah, I'd just like to remind everybody that this is an information gathering session, meaning that the committee is in process of assembling materials that it will examine and discuss in the course of making its findings, conclusions, and or recommendations for the final report at the end of the process. So just be mindful that the committee at this time has made no conclusions. And then we just ask that everyone be respectful of each other throughout the meeting. So with that, let's go to our first two speakers of the day, Tom Kropach and Jose Godoy. Tom will be giving an overview of IOGCC activities, and then Jose will be giving us an overview of the American Petroleum Institute standards process. So thank you both for joining. And Tom, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Okay, thank you, Noel. I have a message that sharing is not turned on, so could you please change that?
Yeah. All right. You should be able to now.
Yep.
Okay.
Works now. So hopefully you're seeing the presentation now. My name is Tom Kropach. I'm the oil and gas director in Wyoming. I'm presenting on behalf of IOGCC this morning because Lori Rotenberry, who is the official or the executive director of IOGCC, was unavailable. And I'm also the official representative for the state of Wyoming to the IOGCC and a member of the committee here as well. And so the IOGCC is a multi-state government agency that champions the conservation and efficient recovery and storage of domestic oil and gas resources while protecting human safety and the environment IOGCC is the authority on domestic oil and gas issues and is a leader in national oil and gas policy. And in related to idle and orphan wells, IOGCC has had a long history of studying this issue along with the states that are members of the IOGCC. And so this morning I'll present some of that work and provide some updates from the latest report that was out and provide some information on where you can go to find more information. So the IOGCC and the state members for many years have been studying this idle and orphan well issue. On the screen here is just an example of several of the reports out of the last 4 or 5 years that the IOGCC has updated or written and put out. There are many other reports, more details on this topic and many other oil and gas issues available on the IOGCC website that you could go download if you're interested in looking at some of this information. This slide shows the efforts that the states have had over the last 5 years or so, or 10 years or so on documenting idle and orphan wells within their states. I think there's about 29 states that are reporting in this slide, and you can see since 2020, 2019 timeframe, the efforts the states have put into locating and documenting orphan wells within their states. You can see the significant increase in documented orphan wells. So what we mean by documented orphan wells in this report are orphan wells where the locations are known, where the wells have been located and found and know to exist. And this does not report on the suspected or potential undocumented orphan wells in the states. On this slide, we're providing information on the number of orphan wells that have been plugged in states. Again, 29 states reporting here. And the orange bars are orphan wells over the years that have been plugged using state funding. And then, as you can see in the gray bars, that is the funding that was provided in the IIJA grants to the states, with most of that funding really kind of ramping up the plugging efforts in 2023, but a little bit early on in 2022 as well. And then the blue line there showing the total orphan wells that have been plugged by the state. So you can see a decline in the over the last 5 years or so in orphan wells plugged by using state funding. And I can just say in Wyoming, as an example, when we received our first initial grant from the DOI using the IIJA funding, we shifted most of our orphan well staff and contractors into plugging with those funds due to certain deadlines and other restrictions and the ramp up into that. So in 2023, 2024, we plugged orphan wells utilizing mostly the federal funding, but in 2025 now and going into 2026, we'll be pivoting back into plugging orphan wells, essentially 100%, almost 100% of funding coming from the state funds for those wells. So as we try to utilize both sets of funding, we're kind of moving back and forth with those, and the numbers will fluctuate a little bit based on what various states do with that funding. This slide, I think it's important to remember as we talk about idle and orphan wells and the state efforts to plug those orphan wells, the industry is also plugging significant numbers of wells that are not orphan. They may be idle, they may just be other production wells. But the blue bars here show the orphan wells plugged by the states, the orange showing the wells plugged by the oil and gas industry, and then a total across the top. So you can see the vast majority of oil and gas wells are plugged by industry. The orphan well problem doesn't mean that every single oil and gas well that's out there ends their life as an orphan well. The majority of those are actually plugged by the oil and gas industry themselves, and they continue to plug wells in all the states that they're present in. Pivoting a little bit to the cost that we've seen in plugging orphan oil and gas wells and trying to compare what those costs are looking at. The average cost across these years, 2018 to 2023, was a little over $37,000, but you can see the increase um, from 2018 to 2023 in plugging in the cost to plug an orphan well. Um, this slide, I think, has 25 states reporting instead of the 29. And the numbers here, each state defines some of their costs and what they mean by plugging an orphan well is slightly different. So the numbers here likely do not include, for most of the states, the site reclamation costs or, the reseeding and some of the work after plugging the well. These costs are mostly defined as the plugging itself, but there could be some of these costs associated with reclamation in certain states reporting as well. And finally, this slide shows the comparison of documented orphan wells in states and the orphan wells that have been plugged. So the orange bars are the numbers that are documented, and the gray bars are wells that have been plugged in those states. And these numbers go back as far as states have them from the beginning of their orphan well program. So there's no start date necessarily on uh, any specific well for the data here. For example, in Wyoming, our orphan well program and the numbers included in this table would go back to the early 90s or even prior to that. And so you can just kind of see where the states are. It's a little bit of a snapshot of where states are and plugging the documented orphan wells that they've had. So again, using Wyoming as an example, we've plugged approximately 7,000 orphan wells in total. And currently on our list, we have 500 left to plug, and we think we'll complete those in the next year or year and a half. And so, the documented orphan wells that we have, which are um, almost all of our wells in Wyoming are documented orphan wells. And so we're nearly finished plugging what we have on our orphan list. And other states are, in different places on documenting that and plugging their documented wells. And that is the updates that we wanted to provide from IOGCC. Lori's contact info is here. And so I think this presentation would be made available. And for more information, please, the IOGCC website has significant details and publications. And always feel free to contact Lori or myself if you have any questions.
Thank you, Tom. Really appreciate that. I think in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and let Jose do his presentation and then have our Q&A afterwards. Just a reminder, if you're in the audience and you want to ask a question, just put it in the Q&A function and we'll try and get to it. We are focused on letting our committee ask their questions, so we'll try to get to everybody. Jose?
Hi, good morning. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me see. Let me try to share my screen now. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Perfect. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to talk about the standards development process at API, at the American Petroleum Institute. My name is Jose Godoy. I'm a senior program manager within the upstream standards segment. I hope you find this information useful. So let's go ahead and get started. So a little bit of background on our organization. API was formed in 1919 as a trade association supporting the oil and gas industry. We formed the standards department in 1923, and we developed our first standards in 1924. So it's been 100 years of standards development, which is something that we're very proud of. Now we cover all segments of the oil and gas industry, from upstream exploration and production to refining, marketing, pipeline, rail, transportation, and petroleum measurements. We are also accredited by the National Standards Institute, ANSI. We published so far over 800 standards with over 650 citations in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations. Now, why is it important? Why we emphasize participation? One, because it gives companies a voice in the development of a standard, sort of a seat on the table. It allows experts to network with other experts and learn from their experiences, sharing lessons to prevent issues before they occur. You also get access to early information. So if you're part of the committee, you get access to know how a standard is written, the position that that standard is going to take. You use knowledge to demonstrate compliance also with other industry standards and to your customers or regulators. And it's an opportunity for company personnel to just gain expertise through consistent participation. This visual here is a visual of the standards program, the upstream standard program. As you see in the blue box, that's the parent committee. That's the Committee on Standardization of Oil and Equipment and Materials. Each individual subcommittee, which are the gray boxes underneath, focus on a specific technical area. And within those individual subcommittees, you have several task groups working on individual standards. So for instance, if you look at the box, the third box where it says valves and wellhead equipment, that's subcommittee 6. Subcommittee 6 has over 10 different task groups working on specific issues. Now, the standards development process. Our standards development process is transparent, which means that anyone can participate and comment in a ballot that is opened. It's impartial, it's fair and just, and we incorporate balance and due process to our standards development. And it's consensus-based, meaning that any action taken has to be made by substantial agreement. Our process is driven by industry volunteers, experts that provide research and also that provide data. Thousands of volunteers from just operators, academia, government, NGOs. As long as you have a material interest in that particular standard, we welcome you. We collaborate with other standards development bodies to ensure that there's no duplications and that we connect globally. And we incorporate proven engineering practices that we update periodically. Now, just to talk a little bit about the documents that we have. Before I just talk about the individual documents that we have, I want to make sure that I'm clear with how we use the term standard. We use the term broadly, but these are what we're going to talk about now is our actual document designations and describes how each document is developed. And I want to also emphasize that there's no structural hierarchy with any of the documents I'm going to talk about now. But as you see now on the screen, specifications, those are documents that are written in such way to facilitate communication between purchasers, manufacturers, service providers. We have recommended practices, which are documents that communicate recognized industry practices. They may include mandatory or non-mandatory requirements. Standards, documents that include elements of both, recommended practices and specifications. Technical reports that are documents that convey specific technical information. And the same thing with bulletins. They provide similar information. And then compliance with industry standards. All of our API documents are voluntary. They only become mandatory if they are codified by federal law or by a jurisdiction, or if they're part of a contract between two parties, say a manufacturer and a purchaser, or if they're part of a company's compliance procedures. And as I mentioned earlier, the document designation does not determine compliance. So we always encourage users to refer to the national and local regulations for that. And consensus, how do we establish consensus? So we do that by substantial agreement when it has been reached by directly and materially affected parties. It means that we need to have more than a simple majority, but not necessarily unanimous agreement. The consensus requires that all views and objections are considered, and that a reasonable effort is made towards reaching a resolution. API's criteria for achieving consensus is defined by the majority of those eligible to vote shall have voted, and approval by 2/3 of those voting, excluding abstentions, have to be met. So with balanced representation, we strive to have a balanced group of committee members, meaning that they could be operators, service suppliers, general interest. We seek input from those groups and participation from those groups. But regardless of what category an individual may fall under, it doesn't prevent them from participating in joining a subcommittee that they might have interest. Um, the balance is mainly considered for a consensus body groups. Those are the groups that vote on the standards. But participation, we encourage everyone to participate. Now, as far as voting privileges, and those are the groups that I mentioned, those are the individuals that actually vote on documents. So we consider a couple of things. They have to be technical competent, know the subject matter. They have to have management support. We want to make sure that individuals that are participating in standards development process can do it and provide the time. It can be time consuming, so we like to make sure that they have management support. Um, that goes back to regular attending the meetings, the subcommittee in the task group meetings, and also voting regularly. They can't just vote on one document and decide not to vote on the other one. We need them to vote consistently and have their company support just in the event that if they don't have a certain expertise in a particular area, they can also work within their companies to get a vote. Now, expression of provisions, these are the terms that we use when we develop a standard. We use shall to indicate that a provision is mandatory, should to indicate that a provision it's not mandatory, but it's a recommended practice. We use may to denote that there's an alternative course of action, and can to use as a possibility or capability. And this visual here, it's just to show you how intricate the standards development process is. It has different components in different moving parts. A new document can take anywhere between 24 to 60 months. A revision can take between 18 to 36 months. But again, the most important factor here is volunteer availability. So just to emphasize some of those areas within the previous visual, upon approval of a standards resource and research document, the relevant subcommittee and parent committee and the task group chair, they initiate all the activities relevant to the standard revision. The standards, the task group chair solicits volunteers, SMEs, to participate in that task group. And then with the task group, along with the API editorial team, develops and finishes that draft for balloting. The balloting is conducted using the API electronic system. Usually a ballot is open for 6 weeks, then it's distributed to everyone that has the consensus body and everyone that has material interest on that document. Information on accessing copies for that ballot draft, submitting comments, or distributing those to those that have interest. You also can find that on the API website. And as I mentioned earlier, it's only one vote allowed per company. Now, for approving a ballot, for those proposed ballot actions to be considered as approved, all comments shall be considered, and the following two conditions have to be met, which are all members who are eligible to vote shall have voted. And then, the majority of members who are eligible to have vote shall have voted. And then at least 2/3 of combined valid affirmations and negative votes, excluding abstentions, shall be affirmative. So if you have 100 people voting in participating in a standards development group, per se, 50 of those have to have participated, and then at least 66 of those have to have voted positive or affirmative. Then disposition of ballot comments. As we emphasize that we encourage everyone to participate, everyone that has material interest, because even if you're not a voter, you have the ability to submit comments to a ballot, and that comment has to be considered. And the comment resolution process is an open process; anyone can participate. And we use the following format. So for a comment, once it's submitted, we either accept it, we accept it in principle. It's either not accepted, but it has to be a technical reason why it's not accepted, or we note it that has been considered, but no change will be made at the time. And then to conclude that process, we issue a recirculation once the comments have been resolved and say the votes have been affirmative. We do a recirculation for 15 days where members can review the document one more time after comments have been considered and the final ballot draft has been changed based on those comments. And that is just to ensure that everyone sees the document and agrees with the changes on the document. You also have the option to reballot the document if the ballot has changed significantly after a comment resolution. There's times where at that point we reissue a ballot. And just some additional resources. This is information that you'll have after the presentation. Some links as to where you can find committee information, our balloting system. If you have any requests for interpretation of our standards, meeting information, and catalog and standards plan. And this is the standards department contact information as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. I really appreciate it. I think we have about 18 minutes for questions. So I'm going to first open it up to the committee, and then we have at least one question in the chat. So if any of the committee members would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Walter, you're the first one.
Hey, thank you, Missy. Hey, Tom, thank you for your presentation. Really appreciate it. I have a question about one of the slides that you showed. I believe it was slide 6, where you displayed the cost of orphaned wells, and they were generally increasing through time. Is that due to the wells that are being plugged? Is that because they're more complex, or because there was some inflationary pressure on those prices? I was just wondering if you could speak to perhaps what you thought was going on behind those higher numbers.
Sure. Walter, thanks for that question. It's a good one. I think it's probably a combination of both. I think we are seeing some inflationary costs and also just inflationary costs due to the inflation across the country, but also just due to the additional workload and the additional opportunity to plug orphan wells in the states due to the grant funding. So there's more competition for the same contractors. I also think states, as they prioritize which orphan wells they plug, they are trying to tackle, those that present the largest risk, either to environment or public health and safety or some of the other issues they may prioritize on. And so, some of those wells that have the higher risk are many times due to the, either emissions or leaking oil or produced water or something from a well. And those wells many times also are more expensive to plug. They're the more difficult wells to plug. So I think it's a combination of all those factors.
Yeah, and they would likely be on a higher priority list of wells that needed to be plugged, right?
That'd be correct. Yeah, they'd be there at the top of the list and trying to get those issues taken care of as quick as possible.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. David?
Yeah. Hey, Tom. Thanks for presenting. I know you wasn't here yesterday, so my question is kind of related to the previous one is around cost and presenting average costs. We had Luke Plants, who is the P&A contractor, speak yesterday about kind of the concerns on when you go out to bid on a fixed rate basis when not all wells are average, right? So a well in Kansas is 800 feet, simplistic versus the complex wells. So, and the contractor starts to take on that additional risk. And then the concern is, are you really getting adequate abandonment at the end of the day? So, my question is, does IOGC break that down into maybe, other buckets of, simple low complex wells to high complexity wells that are more expensive, but you get a bigger bang for your buck because you're reducing more risk, maybe more methane exposure and things like that than the other wells. So whether IOGC has that kind of breakdown in data, or should we be tracking some, trying to bucket the average cost to help maybe better depict the overall cost exposure?
Good question, David. These numbers do not go into that level of detail, but it is something that I think some states look at and understand it. Especially if you're doing like a turnkey project, you may, on those difficult wells, it may be difficult for a contractor to get it done when you find unexpected issues, which is pretty common on an orphan plugging project. And an example of that in Wyoming, we plug some of our orphan wells that are the coal bed methane wells for $3,000 to $5,000. Our most expensive orphan well to plug to date at this point in time is $500,000. So it can vary widely even within a state depending on the type of wells. And one of the things we do in Wyoming to try to help address those issues when you find the unknowns is we do kind of a blend of a turnkey and a T&M type plugging contract with our operators and contractors, so that if the well plugging goes fairly closely to the expected process, to our designed program or plan for that well, then it would be turnkey. And the bid requires they provide an all-in cost to plug the well per the procedure that we put in the actual bid. So we put a plugging procedure for every single well in every one of our bids. And then if it goes out of scope, then we have a procedure in the contract to allow them to bill T&M time and materials costs for that out of scope work. And, that gets signed off on by our inspector and our people and our engineers in the office to show that it's out of scope. And we all agree it was, this unexpected scenario. So we'll not make them try to cover that within a turnkey type bid, because it really isn't fair to them. And as you said, we want to get the well plugged. We agree it wasn't an expected scenario, and we'll pay the cost to cover that so that we get it done correctly.
No, perfect. Thank you.
Nathan. Nathan, are you there? You're muted and you're invisible.
Well, now I'll try to resolve both of those. My apologies. So I want to follow up with two things from yesterday that you sort of addressed today. One is that variability. One of the speakers suggested that, it'd be great to have the standard deviation or some distribution of those costs, or some, functional correlation with the type of costs and the type of wells and activities required. That would really be useful for people, going forward, estimating how much was going to be required, what sort of resources and, training and funding and everything else. The other thing, Tom, you suggested that most states were addressing their highest priority wells. Do you have a sense that A, that's happening more or less everywhere, and B, what those, is there a sort of consistent methodology for that? I mean, what constitutes the highest priority wells? How do you decide what to spend? I mean, one of the speakers yesterday suggested that, he didn't name names, but that perhaps some state would actually want to crank out the biggest volume of wells plugged, and that would be the easiest, cheapest ones, and not necessarily the. I think I've also heard from regulators that in some states that they did want to prioritize those. What priorities do people have? Is there a consistent way to do that? And what sort of information on variability of costs would we have?
It's Nathan. I think that is something that I'll take back to IOGCC and try to look at as far as getting more granular details on the cost and the variability there, and maybe even breaking out the cost here is really to plug it, but there's still a lot to do after the well's plugged with the site reclamation. See if we can figure out what costs are on the environmental side for removing equipment and cleaning up any of the soil or groundwater impacts that may be present, and just restoration of the habitat. So we'll see if we can break that into further details on our next update for this year that we'll be doing here over the next few months. Priority, most states have a priority. I can't speak to any specific state other than Wyoming as far as what their exact requirements are. In our requirements from the statutes and from our rules, we prioritize public health and safety and the environment as, those requirements. So we would look at anything from where the well is located. Is it located next to populated area, next to a school, next to occupied structures or something like that? Is the well leaking? Does it have emissions of some sort, or is it leaking oil or water? Or is it so? Just where is it at? And most states have somewhat similar type of program to try to evaluate the well, and then put it on a priority list. And in some cases, as sophisticated as having it in a database system where the system itself looks at the geography, is it near surface water, for example, is it next to a river or something like that, and ranking their wells in an automated manner through their database of orphan wells. And so we could provide more details. I could connect with those states and see if they'd like to provide some information on how that works in a sophisticated state such as that.
I think that would be really valuable. We saw, I think, in the workshop last year, relatively consistent P&A procedures. There are obviously some variability for local geology and so forth, but I'm not sure. I just don't know how the states compare in terms of their rankings, and I think that'd be valuable.
And I will say, as an example, in Wyoming, we prioritize those wells, but we don't, if we have one well that we have high on our list, we're not going to go into that area and just plug the one well. If there's 50 other orphan wells in that same area, we're going to add them all. The other 50 might be on the bottom of the list, but we're not going to pay the MOB and demob costs, and we're going to go try to be efficient with the funding and plug everything that makes sense to put in one package. We don't want to have just draw a circle around a huge group of wells and say, okay, go plug them. But we do kind of what makes sense for efficiency of the funding and using our time and contractors to do that. So it's a blend. It ends up being a blend of ranking your riskier wells, but then grabbing what makes sense in a package and putting that out for bid.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, I have another question for Jose on the standards development. Once a standard is published, what is the process for revising it? Is it on a regular schedule, 5 years? Does that task group stay together, or how does that work from post publication?
Yeah, typically the task group stays together, and then periodically they'll review what we call requests for informations or requests for interpretations that come from the public. Once those are addressed, sometimes they raised to our attention areas where the standard needs to be updated, or where there needs to be clarification in the standard. So the group remains active. And then, it usually takes to revise the standard, it could take up to 2 years.
Okay,
Thank you. Eilish?
Hi, Jose, I have a question about, like, if a standard is no longer used, is it, or if it's been replaced, or maybe the technology is outdated or not an instrument that can be purchased. What is the guidance that is that still something that's valid because it had been a standard, or how is that handled?
No. So immediately, once a standard has become obsolete because it's been updated, then we make sure that we let the public know that there is a new version with updated technology that users should follow. So we typically withdraw those standards that have been replaced. So I mean, sometimes it's hard to get them out of the internet,
Yeah.
because they just get placed there sometimes. But we try to make sure that everyone understands that there's a new revision that includes updated technology that users should follow. Yeah.
If it's no longer something that's used, it's just, I know, yeah, like you said, it's difficult to get those copies, but that's out, away out of the public domain. But do you have a location where, you say like standards that might not be valid or used
So
anymore?
yeah, so you can go into our website,
Okay.
api.org, and then when you go into the standards portal, you can see which standards are active, and that tells you the latest edition and when was the last time that it was revised. And that kind of that kind of triggers that, okay, well, that last edition that I found on the internet is no longer used, because the new edition was revised in 2023, but the one that I found online was from 1999, So we try to ensure that the public is aware that there is a new standard. We tell people to subscribe to our emails so that they know when a new standard has been revised and when a standard has been withdrawn.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mileva?
Yes, okay, thank you. First question is for Jose. Thank you for introducing us to the API. For me, this was very useful. We identified yesterday in our committee discussion that we do need to pay attention to terminology and define the terms. Any kind of tips or insights from the API, since you have a lot of experience in writing these complex documents? We do need to have a terminology that is kind of acceptable and understanding to practitioners as well as researchers, across the board. So that would be very helpful.
Yeah, so one of the things that we tell our task group members all the time is, think first, what's the intent? What do you want to convey to the user first, right? And then when you're talking about the language that you want to use within a document, is it mandatory? That would be a shall. Is it a not mandatory, but is recommended as recommended practice? Then you use a should. But it always goes back to what is the intent that you want to convey to the user? What do you want to use this for? And how much flexibility do you want to allow the user? So it always comes down to that, and always think about intent.
Thank you, Mileva. Since there's no more from the committee, I'm gonna go to those that came from the audience. And the first one I think is for you, Tom, but it says, when will 2024 data be available? Do we anticipate the data will remain flat from 2023 to 2024, or if we see a continued increase year over year?
So we should be, I think IOGCC plans to try to get the 2025 report out, which would include the 2024 activities by this summer, by maybe end of July at the latest. So it does take a couple months to kind of get the states to be able to get all the data in and have IOGCC compile that into the report. So that is likely the time frame. I think, probably several numbers that could go up or stay the same. I think the documented orphan well numbers will continue to go up. I think states, especially those that potentially have significant numbers, are continuing to work through that process to document the wells that they have and make sure we know where they're at and what's going on with those. So I think the documented orphan well numbers go up, as do obviously the orphan well plugging or plugged well numbers. States continue to try to work through their lists and plug as many wells as they can. I think that the rate of increase of that number may decrease a little. I know some states with the formula grants, there's some additional requirements on endangered species and National Historic Preservation Act requirements, and those have slowed down the process to try to work through those additional requirements of doing the work. And so compared to the initial grant that didn't have those requirements, it is slowing down the numbers of wells that are being plugged in the states that are working on the formula grants. And cost, I think, will probably continue to increase as states try to plug those, those highest priority wells that are usually the most difficult to plug.
Thank you, Tom. And out of one last question from the audience for Jose, how does API decide to create a new standard, best practices, etc.? Oops, just moved on me. Heart, sorry. I think it's whether the public can provide a need for a standard. Can they identify any? Hold on, let me see. Yeah, can the public suggest the creation of one?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have several ways in which you can do that. I mean, the I guess the easiest way is to join the committee, join a particular committee that focus in a specific area that is of your interest. As you participate in the committee, you make that suggestion to the chair, and the chair will listen to you and consider that. Again, it's part of just being part of the process and being part of the discussions. If you know, it sounds very cliche, but if you're not sitting at the table, you can't have, you can't be part of the conversation unless you're sitting at the table. So that's why we always tell folks, join our committees, participate. As long as you have interest, you'll get the emails. You can attend some of the meetings online. We encourage people to attend in person because that just forms a different relationship with other members. But we have several meetings that we conduct online. The other component is that you can, usually you can submit a request for interpretation in which you can point out areas where there might be something that may not be covered in a standard. So that's one way. But once that's been recognized or identified by the committee, then the committee requests the parent committee to initiate a standards action. So that's usually how it starts.
Okay, I'm afraid that's all we have time for in this session. Tom, Jose, thank you very much. It was very informative, and there may be other questions that may come your way during the afternoon if you can stick around. Noelle?
All right, thank you all so much. So we're going to move to our second morning session of the day. That's our monitoring and remediation session. We're going to hear presentations from Nick Giannucci and Katie Smee. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your last names correctly. And we'll have one of Nick's colleagues joining for the conversation portion, Carl Haas. So I will turn it over to you, Nick.
That's great. Thank you, Noel. My slide's going. Good morning. I'm Nick Giannucci. I work with the U.S. Geological Survey in Denver, Colorado. I'm the head of the USGS Orphaned Wells Project. And today I'm going to talk about research that the USGS is doing on orphan wells and groundwater quality. I'm going to start off talking about a new paper that we just published looking at orphan well threats to groundwater aquifers across the United States. Then I'm going to introduce an online interactive tool that we created to help with orphan well plugging decision making. And then lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the complexities of studying groundwater contamination from orphan wells. So we're very excited. We have a new paper coming out. It was just accepted last week, and we're looking at the preprints this week, and we're hoping that it will be on the website very soon, called Water Quality Threats from Orphan Wells in Principal and Secondary Aquifers. And in this study, we look at the location of the orphan wells across the United States in relation to the principal and secondary aquifer systems, and ask questions like which ones are most susceptible to contamination from orphan wells. We look at different susceptibility factors, including the number and density of orphan wells in each aquifer system, different factors that threaten well integrity, and also human factors like groundwater withdrawal in affected communities and populations. One of the key findings of our study is that approximately 60% of the orphan wells in the United States that we know of are in aquifer systems that comprise 90% of the groundwater supply in the United States. So 90% of our groundwater is where 60% of our known orphan wells are located. On the left is a map of the principal aquifer systems in the US. The darker colors are the ones that have the most orphan wells. The yellow have the least. And then in the bottom right is looking at the same aquifer systems based on the density of orphan wells, meaning how many orphan wells are in each aquifer in relation to the size of that aquifer. And these are two of the factors that we analyzed in the study. In the top right are some of the other factors that we looked at. We also considered the age of the well, if there was coal seams or major coal mining present, different properties, corrosivity of groundwater. And then in the blue, we looked at the human factors. What are the withdrawal rates of the aquifers? What is the water being used for? Is it agriculture or municipalities? And how will that affect communities? And what we concluded is that the Pennsylvania aquifers in the Appalachian Basin have the highest number of risk factors, which isn't very surprising because that's where the oldest wells are. That's where some of the largest volumes of wells are located. There's a lot of coal mining and other factors in the area. A number of aquifers in the central part of the U.S. are actually lower risk based on these susceptibility factors. And then the blue, the yellow, and the purple aquifers are kind of a mix based on the different susceptibility factors. And so when we publish this study, it's kind of hard to tell which factors are the most important. So we introduce the data in a way so that the reader can kind of decide which factors you think are most important and then see which aquifers line up with that. So I want to thank Josh Woda for being the lead author on this study. He did a really excellent job, and we're excited to present it to you guys next week. Okay, so last time I spoke in front of the committee was at the workshop in Washington, D.C., and I presented a new data set that we had just published. It's the groundwater quality near orphan wells. And what this data set is a combination of orphan wells and groundwater quality measurements from the National Water Information System of the USGS. And we look at things like total dissolved solids, chloride, bromine, different characteristics within the water quality measurements. And so what we've done is we've created from that data set an online tool for the user to go in and to evaluate the data. And I'm going to give you a quick demonstration of that today. Okay, hopefully you can still see my screen.
Yes, we can.
All right, thanks. So the first thing we do is we go through and we list all the wells in the USGS orphan well data set. If you click on any of the points, all of the information that was provided by the states, including API number, county, location, are listed there. And then we have a map of all the groundwater quality measurements that are located near the orphan wells. There's about 8,500 groundwater quality measurements near orphan wells. And if you click on those points, you can see all the parameters of the different groundwater measurements that were taken. And then what we've done is we've pulled out a couple different parameters for mapping. So we look at specific conductance across the US in this data set. You can see where, total dissolved solids are higher and lower. We also look at chloride. Chloride can affect, the deterioration of the wellbore over time. We look at calcium. Calcium in groundwater is important for setting plugs because it can affect the timing of the curing of the cement in the plugs. And then lastly, we look at sulfate across the U.S. Sulfate can wear down concrete or wear down cement over time and cause a deterioration of the well plugs. And then we look at the Langelier saturation index to see what parts of the country are more corrosive than others. And this is kind of a factor of, well bores in these areas with the red dots are going to corrode at a faster rate than well bores in other areas of the country. And then the last thing we look at is methane in groundwater, areas where we're seeing higher amounts of methane. Finding methane in groundwater does not, indicate that that methane is coming specifically from an orphan well. Like there are natural sources of methane and other causes as well. But we hope that as researchers, policymakers, and well pluggers go out and are doing work across the country, that this tool might be useful for you, that you can go in and see what these different parameters are and help you make decisions. And then the final thing I'm going to talk about today is for this panel on monitoring and remediation. Noel had sent us some questions and some topics that the committee is interested in. And so I'm just going to highlight a couple of these in bold here. So the committee is interested in seeking information on long-term protection of the environment, specifically groundwater and methane emissions and public health and safety. Some specific questions include what subsurface factors are most pertinent relative to failed wells, what strategies have been employed to mitigate them, groundwater monitoring, if well remediation is needed, how should it be done, what about post-plug monitoring? And so these are, complicated questions. I wish I had simple answers. But I'm going to share kind of what we've been working on and what we're discovering and what the challenges to answering these questions are. So let's start with a basic diagram. The purpose of an oil well is to extract hydrocarbons from a producing formation to the surface. And what happens over time when that well is abandoned and it sits there and it starts to deteriorate is, as the wellbore breaks down, it's possible that these fluids can leak out along the wellbore, and the wellbore becomes a pathway to other formations instead of just going to the surface. And, most of the research and most of the effort in the orphan well space focuses on, methane emissions at the surface. But what happens if methane, oil, produced water, other contaminants are not making it to the surface, but are migrating out of the producing formation and are instead going into our groundwater aquifers? So over the last 160 years of petroleum exploration in the U.S., drilling practices and techniques have evolved, presenting a set of challenges to well pluggers based on the location, the drilling era, the geology, and the geochemistry unique to each orphan well. So one of the things that we looked at in the paper is what are the different eras and technologies of drilling. George King gave an excellent presentation yesterday where he broke down about a dozen different years when different changes were made. We went with a slightly simpler approach. We kind of broke them into three eras, starting with pre-1935, when the IOGCC was started. That was kind of the beginning of plugging standards nationally. Then between 1935 and 1972, in the 1970s, the Safe Drinking Water Act was implemented, and a lot of other environmental regulations went into place with a focus on protecting aquifer systems. And then post-1972, kind of in the modern era, is when we have a regulatory framework that tries to protect these aquifer systems. And if we think about the era when the wells were drilled, the oldest wells, didn't have these protections, so they may have been causing damage, since the very beginning. They've also had the most time to do damage. The most modern wells actually have the most protection for our groundwater aquifers, but are going to become more susceptible as they start to deteriorate. And then the wells in between are kind of in the middle. So one of the big challenges is it is extremely difficult, if it's even possible, to determine the timing of groundwater contamination, even when we know that it's occurred. Was the well contaminating from the very beginning? Did it contaminate decades later as the wellbore started to break down? Possibly both. Are the wells still leaking today? Is the damage done? These are questions that are very hard to answer. And then further complicating the matter is also, the geology and the reservoirs are kind of in a dynamic state. And so we know that a deteriorating wellbore can serve as a pathway from the producing formation to the aquifer system. And Over time, reservoir pressure changes. So we'll start with the petroleum reservoir, which is often filled with oil, gas, and produced water. The generation of hydrocarbons can often increase pressure. A lot of oil and gas formations are initially overpressured, but as production goes on, as time goes on, as fluids are extracted from the formation, reservoir pressure drops. Likewise, in an aquifer system, if there's heavy groundwater withdrawal, the pressure in the reservoir of the aquifer system can also drop. And so we know that fluids flow from higher pressures to lower pressures. And so we can have changing scenarios. For example, if we have an overpressured petroleum reservoir, and then we have an aquifer system that has had heavy drawdown, it's going to create an environment where fluids can flow easily from the producing formation into the aquifer. But if we have a normally pressured aquifer and we've had a lot of production in a petroleum reservoir, there might actually be situations where the water from the aquifer might actually start draining or leaking down into the petroleum reservoir. And this can change over time as production occurs and groundwater withdrawal also occurs. So it's an extremely complex environment and one to try to understand and study. So let's take a look at what we can see and what's happening at the surface. On the left is an orphan well in Montana. This well was drilled in the 1930s, had a pump jack. It was an oil well. In the 1990s, the company declared bankruptcy. And so this well has been sitting there just exposed to the atmosphere for the last 3 decades. Wells in this area average about 100 grams an hour of methane that are leaking. So when we find a well like this, when we go to plug a well like this, it's really difficult to understand what is happening in the subsurface. Does this well pose a threat to groundwater? Is there contamination occurring? It's very hard to tell. We don't know. The only thing that we know will help is plugging the well will eliminate the pathway between those aquifers if they were communicating. On the right is a well in Colorado, just outside of Denver. It was drilled in 1993, and these are the storage tanks associated with that well. On the left is crude oil storage, and on the right is produced waters. And so one of the things that I don't think we focus on enough is we spend a lot of time and energy focusing on the well bore and plugging the wells, but we don't talk very often about what's left over remediation of well sites, especially for newer wells drilled in the modern era. There are separators, there are storage tanks, there are flow lines, and they contain contaminants as well. And so if we walk around behind this storage tank, we can see that this well is actually leaking crude oil into the ground. And so I think one area that we could focus more studies is kind of on these remediation sites. It's a lot easier to do a study when we can actually see the contaminants leaking and take samples. And then we can also take nearby groundwater samples. So I think that's an area that we can focus in the near term while we try to understand more what's happening in the subsurface in the long term. So takeaways. Subsurface fluid migration and groundwater contamination is a very complex problem. The mere presence of orphan wells does not imply contamination, and the timing of releases is often unknown. Documenting the location of orphan wells is extremely important because if groundwater users start having problems, knowing the location of nearby orphan wells can lead to more thorough investigation. Surface water and groundwater contamination can occur from storage tanks and flow lines associated with oil and gas infrastructure, in addition to the actual well bore that's leaking. So anyway, here's these are all of our products that we put out in the last couple of years, the orphan well data set and some other things that might help your research. I'll wrap up with that. I'm Nick Chanuchis. If you guys have any questions or comments that you're not able to ask in the chat or you're in the audience, feel free to reach out to me and send me an email. We would love to get your feedback on the different, on the groundwater quality story map that we created, and also on the new paper that's coming out. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Really appreciate it. In the interest of time, I think we'll go ahead and turn it over to Katie to start her presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Let's see. Do you see a PowerPoint screen there? Perfect, good. So Nick very nicely teed up what I'll present today, which is kind of a case study, but I hope that there will be learnings that are useful for the committee and the public, and that might be a bit more broadly applicable. So my name's Katie Smye. I'm the principal investigator for the Center for Injection and Seismicity Research, which is an industrial associates program at the University of Texas at Austin. And what I would like to talk about today is challenges to orphaned and abandoned well integrity from wastewater injection specifically. I'll touch a bit on some of the tools that we use to monitor surface conditions and what that tells us about the subsurface, and what we can learn about the effectiveness of plugging and remediation strategies. So just a bit about our research group. We're an industrial associates consortium. So we do academic research, but we're funded by the oil and gas industry. We have almost 30 industry sponsors you can see on the right, from international super majors to midstream water management companies. And the oil and gas regulators of Texas, the Railroad Commission, and New Mexico, the OCD, are also part of our research collaborative. And broadly, what we aim to do is to understand the impacts of large-scale subsurface injection on the subsurface and surface environment. I have many co-authors or contributors to the work that I'll show today. I represent a large group's work, and you can see some of their names listed here on the left. So I'm going to talk about a case study in the Permian Basin region, and there's a reason for talking about this study. This region, firstly, you saw this morning that Texas is plugging a lot of orphaned oil and gas wells. There are many, many aging vertical wellbores in Texas, and it's also an area of active production, of course. So the Permian Basin region is producing almost half of U.S. oil now, and the U.S. is producing more oil than any country ever in history. Mainly that oil is coming from unconventional horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. And the vast majority of the water that's produced with oil from horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing is re-injected for permanent disposal. So in Texas, well, this is class 2 injection, but it's kind of a nice analog for CO2 injection or other subsurface injection scenarios as well. That water injection causes subsurface pressure increases that we think are posing challenges specifically to orphaned and abandoned wellbores and other just aging vertical wellbores, even if they're not orphaned and abandoned. And you can see on the right just some headlines from last calendar year only, just in 2024, of examples of some of the things that are happening at the ground surface in Texas, specifically mainly leakage of produced fluids at the ground surface in the form of surface flows, well blowouts, or geysers, as some people call them. And so those are major challenges, not only in terms of cleanup and the stakeholders involved, but also in terms of plugging those wells that are clearly actively pressurized, and in terms of public perception of the management of wastewater in this basin. So our group is seeking to focus our research on developing data sets, tools, and workflows to enable proactivity in this region, and maybe some tools that might be useful in other regions as well. We're working to identify areas that are at risk, provide some opportunities to aid in prioritization of plugging schemes, and to determine where operational practices should be modified to mitigate this hazard of leaking orphan and abandoned wells. So in terms of what's happening in this basin, a little bit of background, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you'll be aware that in the Permian Basin, which has two sub-basins, the Delaware and Midland basins, and an uplifted Central Basin platform, there's a long history of conventional oil and gas production, and I'll show some of those maps of those wells later. That production peaked many decades ago and has since declined. But since 2010, there's been a much greater proportion of unconventional oil and gas production, and that is associated with produced water. And what we're seeing in produced water is that the volumes of water that are coming from unconventional production are now about 20 million barrels a day in this larger Permian Basin region. And we focus here because the volumes produced are greater than in any other US onshore basin. Of course, there are produced water management challenges elsewhere, but the volumes here are greater, you can see, than many other basins in the plot on the bottom right. And the footprint here of unconventional produced water differs from the footprint of conventional produced water. That was conventionally typically not a huge challenge for orphan and abandoned wellbore integrity because that produced water was re-injected into the same reservoirs it was produced from for enhanced oil recovery. So this is kind of a pressure balanced historically technique for managing water production. In the unconventional reservoirs, they're injected into other strata, and that poses challenges for pressurization in the subsurface. So I wanted to show you this cross section before we kind of dive into what's happening so that you can zoom in with me on the operations that we think are posing the greatest challenge to orphan and abandoned wells. So here we put all of those operational activities onto one line. It's kind of a smash section version of a cross section from west to east across this basin. So you see the Delaware Basin in the west, the Midland Basin in the east, and that uplifted platform between the two basins. So in the blue dots, we have water produced with oil from shales by horizontal wells. In most cases, for every barrel of oil produced here, we get 3 or 4 barrels of water, but in some areas, 90% of the fluids produced are this wastewater. And this is not particularly clean water. It has to be very heavily cleaned to do anything kind of beneficially with it. It's many times saltier than seawater. It contains radioactive materials. It contains organic compounds. So this is not something that you want necessarily sitting on the ground surface. So that is re-injected historically into deep reservoirs. Those are the purple bubbles above the crystalline basement, the basement sediment interface, kind of the base of this basin. And that operational activity, the deep injection, has been associated with earthquakes to a large degree. And so that has plateaued in recent years and actually come down in some areas to avoid this induced seismicity problem. What we have now is shallow injection into strata between the producing reservoirs and the ground surface. And this shallow injection is the operation that we think is of greatest concern for orphaned and abandoned wells. And I'll show you why here. Now, another 2 cross sections, one in each basin going from north to south. And in these cross sections, I have the same operations, but I've added in the black dots the TD, the well depth of a pre-1980s vertical well. These are not just orphan and abandoned wells, but these are any older vertical wellbore, many of them no longer in use. And you can see that many of these older vertical wells are in the same strata that shallow injection is occurring. And of course, they provide potential conduits linking the shallow injection wells to water wells, groundwater wells. Here we put the bottom screen depth for water wells and to the ground surface itself. And so many of these wells provide potential pathways, as Nick mentioned, between shallow injection strata, the ground surface, and groundwater supplies. In terms of aging vertical wellbores, now again, we're not talking just about orphan and abandoned wells, but I wanted to show you the extent of the well population in this basin. Here, I think I'm showing about 250,000 wells, and they're shaded by age. And on the right, you can see the depth of those wells and histograms of their ages. And you can see that while most of these are concentrated outside the basins themselves, in this conventional production area in structural traps on the basin margins, there are a population of wells in the footprint of current day unconventional production and water injection. And many of those are in the depth range of current injection, 3, 4, 5,000 feet in the shallow strata. And many of them are of a vintage 60s, 70s, and 80s that might be of concern for providing potential or being potential compromised integrity locations. So the injection that I mentioned, the shallow injection, is shown in map view here as the yellow dots. Those are sized by the volume of fluid injected through 2024. And you can see that in both basins, the shallow injection volumes are going up. And that's because we're producing more oil, we're producing more water. Less water is going into deep strata because of earthquakes, so shallow injection is going up. Total injection here is about 16 million barrels a day. And to just put that in a useful kind of context, if that injection was spread out across every minute of the day, we would see an Olympic-sized swimming pool every minute and a half or so injected in the subsurface of this basin. Every hour of every day of the entire year. So you can understand the vast volumes of water that are going back into the subsurface here and coming into contact with well bores that were not cased or plugged either at all or to modern day standards. And so what are we seeing in the subsurface now, and how is that linking to Orphaned? Well, challenges. So in our group, we do detailed geologic model building of these strata, and then we model the pore pressure changes with injection. And you can see an example map of that on the right, just for the Delaware Basin. The scale here is in PSI. Pressure increase, I'm so sorry, from 1983 to 2024. And you can see an increase in pressure associated with shallow injection of several hundred PSI, a 25% increase in the native reservoir pressure over that time period. And I just threw this up there during the morning sessions today, the earlier morning sessions, the plugging priorities for Texas before I bring up the next slide. There are a range of factors that are considered in prioritizing plugging, but what I want you to see here is that priority one wells for plugging are wells that are actively leaking at the ground surface, either methane or in many cases, most cases, produced water. So priority one wells we know are actively leaking. And so with our pressure maps, I wanted to show you we did a study on several hundred wells of orphaned wells in Texas based on the Texas plugging priority by the regulator. And you can see in black dots, many wells don't have a priority at all. They're not currently prioritized for plugging, but there are a population of wells that are priority one for plugging. Those are the red dots. And when we compare that to our subsurface shallow injection pressure model, we can see that leaking wells have experienced an average pressure increase of more than 200 psi. And when we layer on wells that were previously plugged, and here I have the year of plugging for each of those wells, these are the wells that are black diamonds, they have experienced an average, or they did experience an average of 172 psi pressure increase in the year of plugging. So it's clear here that there is a link between this subsurface pressure increase and leaking orphaned wells produced water at the subsurface. But building those geological models and pore pressure models is extraordinarily complex, takes a lot of time and data and man hours. So we're looking at other techniques now to monitor what's happening in the subsurface and potentially highlight areas of concern. And so one of those things is INSAR surface deformation data. And this is gleaned from the Sentinel satellites that pass over this region of West Texas every 12 days or so. And they can monitor the elevation of the ground surface. And we can calculate over a specific time period how the elevation of the ground surface has changed. So the map I'm showing here, you can see two paths stitched together. There's a line between the two basins, but it shows the change in ground surface elevation from 2015 through 2022 over this 7-year period. Purple areas are where the surface is going down, subsiding, and orange areas are where the ground surface is coming up or uplifting. And in general, there's a signal of subsidence. That's because we're producing, as Nick mentioned earlier, fluids from the subsurface. And like sucking something out of the ground with a straw, you're removing the fluids and there's compaction of the reservoir and the ground surface goes down. But if you look closely, you can see there are some areas, particularly right here along the Texas-New Mexico state line and other isolated areas as well where we see uplift of the ground surface. And those are areas we think where shallow injection pressurization is so great that it's overcoming that signal of subsidence from production and causing elevation of the ground surface to go up. And these are the areas where we have concerns about surface flows from orphaned and abandoned wells. So I want to show you just quickly two case studies and how we're using this particular monitoring or this particular tool to monitor the subsurface and what's happening. And so we're overprinting here now the same data set of orphaned and abandoned wells with some additional data we've gotten from operators on where we've seen surface flows or blowouts. Of course, many of these wells are plugged by operators. And what we know is that 90% of wells that are leaking at the surface are in areas where uplift is being observed in INSAR data rather than subsidence. So there's a very strong correlation here between the ground surface showing us that something is occurring in the subsurface that may cause an orphaned and abandoned well to leak. So two quick case studies. One is in this area where we see this strong uplift signal, many surface flows and many well blowouts. And this is an area where New Mexico, which doesn't permit a lot of shallow injection, has produced water volumes, several million barrels a day of which are being trucked across the state line into Texas for reinjection into shallow strata. So that's why this area is particularly problematic. We built a detailed model here, understanding the geology, the injection wells, the aging vertical well bores, the incidence, and the surface deformation to calculate something that we call injection capacity. And so we think that this is a workflow or a method that can tell us where injection capacity in the subsurface has been exceeded and how well that links to orphan and abandoned wells. So there's a lot of work and a lot of geologic and engineering modeling that goes into this. But what we end up with is what you see on the bottom right is an understanding of injection capacity. And we note that there are many areas where injection into these shallow reservoirs has exceeded the ability of the reservoirs to maintain that pressure increase. And we find that many of these areas are linked with areas where we have surface flows and well blowouts. Okay, I want to show you just one more case here before I wrap up. You might have noticed these little dots of surface uplift in Crane County in Texas, and I wanted to talk about how we're using this to try to understand the effects in the subsurface of well plugging and therefore the efficacy of plugging programs, or the efficiency or the success, I should say. So when we zoom in on that area, we see that there are many orphaned and abandoned wells in this area that are actively leaking at the surface. And so immediately we would look at this surface uplift and say, this is potentially an area of concern because we know that there are aging vertical well bores in this region. And when we look at the surface deformation here over this period from January 2021 through April of 2024, we overprint that with operations. So you see in white dots, these are wells that are used for EOR. That should be pressure balanced, so we don't take a lot of account of that. But then there are wells that are used for saltwater disposal, injection, and those are the blue dots. And you can see that those are to the northwest of the main areas of uplift, but we have this arcuate pattern of surface uplift that is forming in this region. And I want to show you how that corresponds to surface flows and blowouts observed here. So we are going to track the time series of the change in elevation of the ground surface at 2 points, the red diamond here to the northwest and the blue diamond to the southeast, two of these areas where we have strong surface uplift signals. We are also tracking here the monthly volumes of saltwater disposal in this region. So if we look first at May 2021, so this is just a few months into our analysis, we've already had one surface flow from an older vertical wellbore here to the south. This particular area hadn't seen a lot of uplift, but we have a lot of offset injection that's already occurred. You can see that increase. And we have some surface uplift as denoted at the red point here. So a little bit distal from this region. As we move to the next event, that event is occurring very close to our blue data point. And you can see prior to that well blowout, we had seen many centimeters of surface uplift occurring before that well blowout even happened. And then interestingly, as that well blowout occurred, you see that uplift plateaued. So there was a release of the pressure from the subsurface from that orphaned well, and the pressure dissipated in the subsurface. But of course, that well was then plugged, but that well was plugged while injection operations were still occurring. You can see the monthly injection volumes happening. So when the well was plugged, surface uplift increased at that point yet again. As we move through in time, we had another event close to the red point. You can see that surface release again resulted in the ground surface elevation subsiding a bit, but it came back up again. And then finally, the last event, which occurred in December of 2023, and this was a very problematic well to be plugged in light of the pressure increases and the surface uplift that had occurred. But you can see that we had had many tens of centimeters of surface uplift after the event 2 occurred, and as pressure continued to increase and surface uplift continued to increase, there was yet again another well blowout. So I wanted to show this case study just to say that in the cases of plugging these orphan and abandoned wells and older vertical well bores, if the subsurface conditions that potentially precipitated those blowouts are not, or those surface leaks are not dealt with, we may see surface uplift and continued blowouts in those areas. So I'll stop there. I don't need to read this. Want to leave time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. That was very interesting.
Sure.
At this point, I think we will open it up to the committee for questions for Nick and for Katie. And I see Nathan has already got his hand raised, so I think you're going to get lots of questions. So, Nathan, you're up.
Right, right, Katie. So the other issue I think we've seen in DMG injection has
Yeah.
not just been for shallow and abandoned wells, but also the overpressure is so great, and there's so many wells that produce in other parts of the DMG that you're getting, existing production sort of swamped out because of these
Yeah.
deeper
Yeah.
frac water. And I'm just concerned. I'm questioning: is there any motivation to say we just should stop injecting into these zones that are overpressured and put the stuff back in the deeper zones where it came from?
Yeah. So it's a great
That's
point.
not really part of today's topic.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. I would be very happy to discuss that more offline. I guess what I would say is that there are challenges in both deep and shallow strata. Production interference, orphan and abandoned well blowouts, with the deep strata, earthquakes. And so, this is a basin that's producing nearly half of US oil. And if operators can't dispose of their water and there are not alternative solutions for beneficial reuse, there will be impacts to production in this region if we say no to everything. So, this is, I class this as an emergency, this shallow injection challenge. We talked a bit earlier about costs for well plugging. I know of cases here in wells with surface flows that have cost many millions of dollars to plug. So I think, this is an emergency not only for the regulator, but for operators who need their injection optionality to continue producing. So it's a great point. Yep.
Thank you, Katie. Mary?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the very interesting. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for the very nice presentations to both of you. I guess this is more of a question for Nick, but I wanted to ask about the USGS groundwater quality data. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, most of those wells were not drilled for the purpose of looking at orphan well impacts. First, is that correct? And is there any effort to drill specific monitoring wells to understand groundwater impacts from orphan wells?
So you are correct. Yeah, the USGS National Water Information System has been online for Hey, Carl, you with us? Carl was actually the lead author of the data set. But they were
I'm
not.
here.
Yeah.
So the answer to that is largely yes, that is an aggregate data set of national networks like NACWA, but also individual regional studies. There are a few studies that are aggregated inside of the database that were inspired by water quality that seemed problems related to oil and gas impacts, but that data set is an aggregate of a lot of different uses.
But are any of those like looking at orphan well or abandoned well specific or inspired by abandoned well or orphan well specific concerns?
There's a couple in specific. So there was a study that Kinga Revez and Kevin Breen did in around 2010 that was originally suspected to be a water quality problem related to orphan wells, but the problem was ultimately traced to a gas storage field. So some of the data in that data set was collected very proximally to orphan wells. And then the other is that a lot of the water quality samples that are collected in the LA basin are being collected with the context of legacy oil and gas drilling in the LA basin. So those are the portions of the aggregate that I can readily point to, that it was like people are worried about legacy oil and gas and orphaned and abandoned wells in that area.
But were there new wells drilled, or okay? So in addition to the existing, are there any?
We are not drilling
planning
wells right now,
to? No. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Walter.
Thank you, Missy. Katie and Nick, thank you for your presentations today. Katie, nice to meet you, and Nick, great to see you again. It's been a while.
Good to see you, Walter.
Yeah. My first question is for Katie. You had talked about the subsurface fluid with the subsurface uplift and the subsidence, which I thought that work was fascinating. That was the first time I'd seen that. Have you looked at the geology in those areas to see if the geology is more or less similar in the areas that are being uplifted versus that that is subsiding? I mean, is it similar? Is there any faulting? How would you characterize that?
Yep, it's a great question. There is definitely a geologic signal in the surface uplift data, and in fact, we can see lineaments that kind of reflect shallow faulting. We can actually map faults from surface uplift data. So there's a lot going on. The subsidence versus uplift is really strongly operational rather than geologic, but there is more work to be done there on the geology. There are a couple of areas that are a bit mysterious where we have a comparison of similar operations in two areas, and the surface uplift and subsidence differ. And so we're doing a little bit of work there on kind of the geomechanics, looking at the overburden. There's several thousand feet of evaporite between this shallow injection strata and the ground surface. So we're doing some work on the geology there. There are variations, and there's a signal there for sure.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. And just a quick follow-up question. And Katie, I believe you mentioned that most of the work that you had done was focused around perhaps the vertical component of many of the wells in the Permian Basin. Have you looked at the horizontal component of any of these wells as well? And I guess this question is really either for Nick or Katie. Can you distinguish whether there is a contribution from the horizontal component of any of these wells with respect to well failures, well integrity, or anything associated with that?
It's a good question. We have not looked at that simply. We haven't done any kind of even a spatiotemporal look at frac fluid injection and production and orphan and abandoned well integrity or surface flows or other things. So that would be an interesting thing to layer on. I don't know about that.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with anybody studying the impacts of hydraulic fracturing to wellbore integrity of nearby wells. Obviously, if a frac connects with a horizontal well to an orphan well, you're at risk of blowout that way. But
Okay, great.
What I
Okay.
would add to that answer is the radius of impact for injection, especially the shallow injection, is so much greater. Fluids and pressures are
Yeah,
traveling much further, of course. It's a more of a
sure.
conventional injection reservoir, so
Mhm.
I would be less concerned about it. But
Okay,
it's an
great.
interesting idea.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. David?
Hey, good morning. Thanks, Nick and Katie. Very impressive presentations. My name's David Perrin with Chevron. Uh, my question would be for Katie, and I think it also is from some in the audience. And sometimes we use orphan and abandon as an interchangeable terminology. And where I'm going with this is for all the cases of surface leaks, surface blowouts, and all that, do we have a that's what we're finding hard to do is trying to understand the data. It's easy to say all these wells are orphaned and unplugged. That's why they're on the list for states to go plug them and all that. So they definitely pose a risk because there is no barrier to stop leaks or from surface very shallow injection. But of the subset that y'all have analyzed, do y'all have the breakdown of what is actually were plugged, maybe not plugged to today's standards, but on paper or plugged to pre-modern standards? What is that subset of it, or is it all lumped together when we say orphan and abandoned wells?
That's a great question, and one that really needs to be worked in a bit more detail is to look at some of these specific cases. I'll try to answer this and the question that Noel dropped in the chat, which is how are incidents and events determined? We have been trying to build this database, not just orphan and abandoned wells, which we work with the field offices for the regulators of Texas and New Mexico to gather, but also when an operator tells us they have an incident on their acreage, when they have an incident for a well that's completely undocumented. They may not even have a dot on a map and have any idea of the condition of the well. They just know that they have a surface flow or a geyser or a blowout. So these wells are in all types of conditions. Some of them were plugged, some of them were not. We carry all of them, and we don't have a lot of information necessarily about each of these individual cases. I would say there's an argument to be made to do a deep dive into a couple of them to try to understand wellbore condition and the link between that and surface flows. In terms of whether there are additional events, this goes to the webinar chat question. Absolutely, there are more events occurring. And I was just out in Midland a couple weeks ago on a panel, and I gave a public plea. If you know of these cases, which we pull from regulators, but also from the news media, and also from temporary flight restrictions that are put in place when there are surface flows, for example, we take them from all of those cases. I did a public plea, and I had 5 or 6 ranchers come up to me and say, I have this point on a map where I have a blowout and I don't know what's in the subsurface. There's no well on the surface. I have to dig down and excavate. So there are many more of these cases and a wide range of conditions. A lot more work to be done. So your point is a good one, and I echo your frustration, David, about not having enough information about the particular conditions of some of these wells. But to answer your question, I'm including orphaned, abandoned, not orphaned or abandoned, existing wells, older vertical wells.
Okay. No, I
Yeah.
appreciate that because that's where we're trying to. I mean, we can draw certain conclusions, right? They're probably not plugged, whether it has no plugs or plugged in a certain era. But at the same time, trying to understand true plug failures is with a data-driven to back it up. But I think y'all are doing great work on that because we know it's not zero, but we don't know if it's all 1 million orphan wells either. It's somewhere in between, and I don't know how we really get to that number without what y'all are doing is trying to grab as much data as you can. So thank you.
Thank you for the feedback. Very helpful.
Hey, are there any more questions from the committee? I think we've actually addressed all the ones on the chat too. Is that right, Noel? Did we get all of them?
Yeah, we did address, there were 2 questions that came in and we addressed those. I see Maleva has her hand raised now. So we can...
Okay, Maleva, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Katie and Nick. Excellent presentations. Lots of data. So I've been kind of thinking since yesterday's presentation on these different eras and what era are we on? is there maybe a new era? Because, from Katie's presentation, looking at the impact of all these injections and we have these new technologies that will eventually come online, like CO2 storage and hydrogen storage and mineral extractions from brines. So there will be more fluids going in and out of subsurface. I guess this is more philosophical questions. Are you both hopeful that we can solve this? And what would you focus on if you had, unlimited money and time to go for one topic?
Nick, do you want to tackle that first?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting comment about, are we entering a new era? I think there's a focus now on plugging wells for a purpose that is preventing contamination and fluid flow, where I think in the past industry was more focused just on meeting regulation for an economic value. So I hadn't really considered that. I do think the impact of the work that we're all doing is going to have a long-lasting impact on the industry. And I also think one of the concerns in the back of my mind is, based on the different eras of plugging and starting to see well plugs fail in different parts of the country, is, are there going to be decades from the 50s, 60s, 70s that we're going to have to go back and replug all those wells in addition to, the orphan and the unplugged wells that are out there? And, at the workshop back in July, one of the big questions was, how long do well plugs last? And, I still think there's a lot of questions about that. I think today's well plugs are the best we've ever done. And, I hope will be sufficient to last a long time. But then we have to start asking, like, when did it start to become sufficient to last for decades or a century? So I'm not really looking forward to the future and starting to figure out or starting to learn when that happens.
Yeah. I'm hopeful, but I do have concern about the extent to which we are layering operations in areas, of course. And so, yes, we're in a new era, I would say, in the Permian Basin, where wells that might have been plugged in the 60s, for example, to withstand a certain pressure are now seeing up to 1,000 PSI pressure increase from injection. That is a challenge, right? That they're not meant to withstand that type of pressure. And so, and as we turn to CO2 injection, I think that what we need to do is to take the learnings from this wastewater injection experiment. As far as I know, this is probably the largest subsurface injection experiment anywhere. The volumes that have been injected, billions and billions of barrels. We need to take the learnings and we need to apply them. For example, one example I have a concern is area of review. In a CO2 injection scenario, what is your area of review for plugging a well? Some of the cases that I showed today of orphan and abandoned well challenges have a causal agent that's 12 miles away, right? And so the subsurface conditions can promote that type of pressure plume migration that's anisotropic, that goes greater distances than I think people expected. And we need to take that learning and apply that in other subsurface injection scenarios to do so safely.
Thank you both very much.
Are there any more questions from the committee? Any from the audience? We do have a bit of time. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Noelle at this point. Noelle?
All right. Seeing no additional questions, I'll just go ahead and thank Nick and Katie for joining us today. Those were excellent presentations, and Carl as well. Thank you for joining in on the conversation. Yeah, just thank you so much. And we'll give about 15 minutes back to the lunch break. And then we will reconvene at the scheduled time for the afternoon session at 12:30 Eastern. And we'll keep this webinar rolling, so you're welcome to just, mute yourself, turn off your camera and stick around, and then we'll just tune back in at 12:30. All right, everybody. Well, we're at 12:30, so why don't we go ahead and get started? We will start with Robin Gerlach from Montana State University. So Robin, you're free to share your screen and get started.
You can see that and you can hear me?
Yep, yes, we can.
Okay. Well, I guess I want to start out with thanking the committee for inviting me to share some of my R&D that we've conducted over the last 15 years or so. And I also want to thank Noel for organizing everything and herding cats. I know how much work that is. And just for those who don't know me, so my background is not in petroleum. I'm a chemical, biological, environmental engineer with very, very little experience in oil and gas, but quite a bit of experience in bio, environmental, and other technology development. And I want to talk about the mostly fundamental, but also applied research that we conducted on a novel permeability control and potentially well remediation technique. If I had to give it a little more of a concrete title, I would call it ureolysis-induced mineral precipitation. And I'll explain to folks what this is here in a minute. But in a nutshell, it precipitates out calcium carbonate, basically a limestone, and we can use this to seal fractures, as you can see here. You'll see this slide or these images popping up here in a while. Now, while I'm presenting here, there's a number of people who have been involved, and just on the MSU side, the main investigators include Adrian Phillips, Al Cunningham, Kat Kirkland, and Lee Spangler, but there have been many, many, many others. All right, just to kind of set the stage again, and most of you know this, and I learned this about 15, 20 years ago. When wells leak, there are a number of possible pathways that leakage can occur through. It can be interfaces, it can be cracks, it can be microannuli, however you call them. But these can be very, very small. And as George King pointed out yesterday, about 40% or so of the wells he estimated after completion have some defect. There might not be a leak, but they might have some defect. And usually we use cement to seal them. And looking up kind of the viscosity of cement, it's much more viscous than water. And also the particles, they're probably smaller ones, but they are, for the smaller ones in the 100 micrometer range. And if you have a fracture or fissure that is smaller, you're going to have a hard time sealing that with cement, or you have to apply really high pressures, and that's not always desirable either. The microbes that we're using are about 1 to 2 micrometers in size that are producing these minerals, and we can deliver them in aqueous fluids that have about 1 centipoise or so as viscosity. Here's some images, again, a little blown up. You can see this biocement, this kind of brownish, whitish in a shale core. And here you can see a cement steel interface that also has biocement after the treatment. How does this treatment occur? Well, we use an enzyme that can either be bacterially or plant produced. And we hydrolyze urea to produce ammonia and carbonic acid. The ammonia then functions as a Bronsted-Lowry base, increasing the pH. And the carbonic acid turns into carbonate. And if there's calcium around, we precipitate out calcium carbonate. And this is what we call a biocement. And you'll see that this can seal all sorts of permeable media. Now, some of you might probably think I'm crazy. Bio minerals, well, we all have them around us and within us. They are very, very common in nature. Now, the organisms that we are using are not involved in any of these very intricate materials that are being built, but what they do is, and here the organisms are in green, you can see, oh, there we go. How the mineral that's in gray is precipitating within and downstream of this colony. So these organisms are precipitating the mineral. If we look at a porous medium, and you can kind of see here, it's about 1.5 by 1 centimeter or so. You can see the biofilm, the green weaving back and forth, and at about 8 hours or so, it starts kind of stiffening up, and then you start seeing these gray objects. These are calcium carbonate precipitates that are precipitating. And by the way, the same process occurs in everybody's urinary tract system when we have a urinary tract infection. And this is how quickly, this was about 24 hours, urinary tract stones can grow with a hefty infection. So over a period of about 10 or so years, we really transitioned from something that was on the reagent tube scale down to single cell scale and now up to the field scale. We also proudly said that we worked on the crane scale. This is a large high pressure vessel that's about 80 centimeters or so in diameter that had a large sandstone core, and I'll show that in a second again. This was, of course, not done in isolation. Schlumberger, Southern Company, MET, Shell, and Loudon Technologies, who Jim is the principal of, were involved in this. And this happened kind of during the time when Jim transitioned out of Schlumberger. So to make a long story short, in 2014, after about 6-8 years of doing this, we had access to a site at the Gorgas power plant to a test well that was drilled with DOE funds. It was kind of up here above the plant. And together with Jim, Schlumberger, folks from MET, and Southern Company, we were able to access a well. And our concept was to basically create a fracture in a sandstone layer and then use our biocementation to seal that sandstone layer. And lo and behold, it worked. We basically predicted through a model that it would take about 25 calcium and 6 inoculation injections with our bacteria that perform hydrolysis of urea. And we were very close to that prediction. That's when we started not being able to inject anymore below that pressure that we had set as the maximum pressure. And when we refractured the formation, and Jim could talk about this more eloquently, we actually needed a higher fracture extension pressure after biomineralization sealing, indicating that we actually made the sandstone in a nutshell stronger. So this is how it looked. Wasn't the best weather. We made it through it. We had our U-Haul van as our field lab and prep lab. We had our weed sprayer, and we used that to pump our biomineralization fluids and our bacteria into a 30-foot baler that had a little valve on the bottom that was secured with a pin. And once it hit the color stop, it opened up and we released this. And you saw we did this about 30 times with the biomineralization solution and the bacteria. And this guy from Schlumberger had to keep going up the man lift, doing this about 30 times. This was our very first time we did this in 2014. We did this a total of about 5 times, and I'll show a little more about this here in a second. But what I want to point out is if we ran laboratory experiments as well, and you can see here a sandstone on the bottom left, and you can see here what looks like a fracture. So we fractured this, and then we actually sealed the sandstone using the same method multiple times, either under high pressure or ambient pressure, and it works really well. And there we also increased that fracture pressure. On sandstone, really fine pores, we mostly form kind of a seal, and that makes sense when we think about the sandstone fracture at the well, that we were not able to inject anymore because we probably formed this film along the fracture, so we couldn't inject in the sandstone anymore unless we used really high pressures. The second experiment was more focused on leakage. So Jim identified an area where we had delaminations or channels close to the wellbore. And we basically had casing perforations in this area. And then we inject our microbes and our cementation solutions, and we watched injection pressure, and then we did some ultrasound imaging tool logging. Well, you can see if you look at pressure over time, you can see, and also flow rate, Our flow rate went down, our pressure we kept below our 1200 psi surface pressure, which we considered a safe pressure not to fracture the formations. And once we were done, we performed basically a shut-in test, and these two would actually pass the Texas Railroad Commission criteria for injection disposal wells. It also passes other tests, but this is the one that I put on here. So we pressurized the well to either 300 or 500 psi, and our pressure loss was less than 10% after, oh, excuse me, that's after 30 minutes. So, but it did pass it. So I'm just seeing this now. The UCIT log, again, for those who are not familiar with it, what you see is basically this circular image here laid out. And before we can see quite a bit of red, which is indicative of gas, blue, indicative of liquid, and this tan, indicative of solids. And what you can see after the biomineralization treatment, you can see a lot more tan here and a lot less red and blue, indicating that we have produced quite a bit of solids behind the wellbore. And again, together with the pressure testing, it indicates that we sealed definitely the major channels in. To visualize this, we had a wellbore analog. This is about 4 inches in diameter. We were able to inject through the middle, then we had the perforations. And if you look at it, we dremeled in a little defect that we visualized here with fluorescein. And after the biomineralization treatment of 5 days, we reduced the overall permeability of the system by about 5 orders of magnitude. And this is available in this publication, and I have the references at the end of the presentation. What got me really excited was when we dissected this, that the biomineral actually looks like it really integrates with the cement, the cement being here, the biomineral being here, the plexiglass being here. And it looks like there's a really strong bond potentially between the biocement, this calcium carbonate, and the well cement. So that indicates that we have a good bonding, and that might explain why we have higher fracturing pressures after the treatment in sandstone. We also, again, with Jim's and other people's help, were able to do this on a more production type of well. This well had a thief zone about 30 or so feet above the oil-bearing formation. And we went in there twice, once with a baler that I showed you, and once kind of with a tubing stacking system. And what you can see is with the baler, we were able to reduce the pressure flow ratio, but this, and we are looking at cumulative volume injected. This takes about 10 minutes. This took about 7 days. And then we tried something that didn't work, and then we reduced. Then we used the fresh cells in the tubing, and this took about 2 days. So we have now a way to do this a lot faster. This was done. We also developed this trailer, and BioSqueeze, which was involved in this, actually took that as a model to build their trailers that they are now using for their work, growth reactors, and so on and so forth. So with that, I do want to point out that this involves a lot of people. And again, Jim, you'll hear from him later on. He was an instrumental part of this. MET, which is a precursor of BioSqueeze, had a major contribution to this, and Southern Company, without them, we would have never been able to do this. Now, I want to point out one more thing, if I may, and that actually doesn't relate to well sealing, but might be relevant to folks here. We are now looking more at using biomineralization for stabilization, including building new materials. And what I really want to point out, this is an NSF-sponsored project. This is one of our grad students who's balancing on one of these bio bricks that we made the same way that we sealed these wells, and it bears its whole weight. So we are getting to a point where we can stabilize things. And I don't know how relevant this is, except for well bore stability if they aren't cased. But I did want to point out that this is something where this biomineralization might or might not have other implications and uses to folks who are around here. We're looking at other ways of doing this. We've mostly been doing the microbially induced. We've used enzymes. We've also used thermally induced uriolysis to produce minerals. And we're currently working on a geothermal project. And this is a replica biomineralized of our home range that we have. This is about 3 feet by 1 foot by 1 foot. So we can build larger things even at a university of this. And here you can see our bobcat. So with that, I'll just leave this up for a second. If there are any clarification questions, I'll be happy to answer those, but I think we want to keep inquiries to a minimum at this point.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, we're going to just move, I think, from speaker to speaker so we can preserve the bulk of the time for a conversation at the end. And folks that have clarifying questions, just hang on to those, and we can pose those to Robin or the specifically to other speakers during the discussion. Next is Bryce.
Thank you, Jim. Go ahead and share my screen. So I'm Bryce Yeager. I'm Vice President for the Eastern U.S. for BioSqueeze. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting us to present today. I also like to thank Robin for his presentation and really providing a luxury for me in that I don't have to go through the ins and outs of MICP, being that we are a company that effectively utilizes biomineralization to seal leaking oil and gas wells. So from the original iteration and design that Robin showed for a biomineralization field trailer, we're now on our 3rd generation, which is shown in the picture here. So for all the reasons that we know, cement leaks when used in a downhole environment, whether it's because of debonding from casing, debonding from the formation, or cracking or gas channeling while being set, leaks do occur. And when they occur in the annular space or when they occur up the casing, they need to be remediated. And when moving an orphan well to being a fully plugged and bubble tight, this presents quite a few issues with properly sealing a wellbore in that process. So there are several tools that are existing on the market. Some of those involve placing cement into some of the void spaces behind casing. Some of those, such as section milling or rotary cutters, involve removing a section of casing in order to place cement or perhaps resin in that space in hopes to create a seal. Biomineralization is a rather new but effective tool. Also, casing expansion is utilized to enlarge casing and return a seal between casing and existing cement behind the well. Or other tools such as thermite or bismuth, they use high temperature heating elements to either melt a section of the wellbore or place a bismuth tin mixture into some of the void spaces. Of course, every technology and tool has its trade-offs, and candidate selection is critical to ensure an effective seal downhole. I like to utilize this image off to the right of a wellbore and the different size void spaces in the cement. Here we can see a large void which can be filled with bulk application of one material, but some of the more complex pathways, smaller pathways, can be difficult to seal with rather viscous materials. One tool that we like to use, one tool that we like to use is referencing SPE paper that was published in 2007 by Michael Cohen at Shell. Really enjoy this paper in that it contains a data set of 137 squeezes that were performed in a West Texas field on producing wells. But while analyzing 50 different fields in that data set, they used multivariate analysis to really hone in on what the first order variables are around success. And from that, they created some rules of thumb and design factors to utilize when designing cement squeezes for behind casing. one of which is injectivity factor, and I'll talk about that a bit more on the next slide. Another one is a recommended cement volume based off of the injectivity factor and the desired length of cement behind casing. And the third that I want to highlight is squeeze pressure, in that most times, in order to effectively place cement behind casing in the right application, a significant amount of pressure isn't required, but rather a low pressure is desirable so you don't break down any weaker formations in proximity to the wellbore and lose that height of cement behind casing. One of the big takeaways that we like to focus on is the fact that of this data set of 137 squeeze treatments, no, 137 wells, the first attempted cement squeeze on the wells was effective about a third of the time. Of the remaining 2/3 of squeezes, with up to 5 attempts, that success rate never climbed above 60%. So really highlighting the fact that cement is not always the right tool to create that seal in a downhole environment. The injectivity factor that's highlighted in the paper is rather simple, and it translates to the field very well, in that the injectivity factor is just injection pressure in PSI divided by the effective injection rate in barrels per minute. And that can be related to the relative size of the pathway trying to be sealed behind casing. Looking at different cement blends and the relative particle size within each one of those blends, the paper relates back to the injectivity factor. As you can see, as we move to the right, the injectivity factor is increasing, and the relative particle size of the recommended cement blend is decreasing. So we find ourselves in the 2,500 to 3,500 range, where they're recommending solely microfine cements, not regular grind API cements. In addition to the work done in the paper, we've extrapolated and included additional products that are newer to the market, including resins and also biomineralization for some of the higher injectivity factors. I want to highlight that viscosity becomes a concern when injecting a viscous material into a very small pathway. So maybe some familiar images on this slide through the collaboration with Robin and Jim at Montana State and Montana Tech. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but focus more on some of the lessons that we've learned in using biomineralization in the field, and how that interaction actually takes place downhole. So when injecting a biomineralization fluid into an existing cement sheath behind casing, we find that the decreased viscosity of the fluid, being around 1.05 centipoise, allows for deeper penetration into that cement sheath to create that seal. This is a before and after Baker Intex log from a gas storage well that was logged pre and post biomineralization treatment. You can see in this case, the elimination of the pink and red areas that highlight fluid, microannuli, and gas being replaced with gray to dark gray areas are areas where that microannulus was removed and effectively sealed with the calcium carbonate precipitated from the biomineralization process. Calcium carbonate does show up on a cement bond log because it has a compressive strength. Once the process is completed, that wellbore is left full drift, fully open, to allow for re-entry or setting of additional cement plugs to work your way out of the hole. And also, as the fluid begins to seal off the path of least resistance behind casing, we find that the fluid becomes self-diverting and will flow to the new path of least resistance, sometimes effectively creating a seal both up and down in the well from the point of entry. Compared to other materials on the market, the biomineralization fluid is allowed to penetrate some of the smallest pathways that can be sealed, in that biomineralization effectively can get into a 1 micron size pathway. So through sealing over 200 wells to date, we've found new and different ways to apply the biosqueeze process and inject biomineralization fluid into leaking oil and gas wells. We discussed sealing annular leaks through a downhole deployment, where the area of injection, either perforations, multi-string cut, or sand notch that has gone through the casing string to create that contact area with the cement sheath. That area is straddled with tubing and a packer. Because the injection rates are rather low by oil field standards for a treatment in the range of sub-gallon per minute rates, we spot fresh biomineralization fluid to the end of our tubing string, set the packer, and then begin that injection process to seal off the leaking pathways behind casing. This can also be used for preventing gas migration on E&P wells, and also can be injected directly into leaking cement plugs in a wellbore. Biosqueeze can also be utilized through a surface injection, and this is facilitated by a delay in the deposition process of the bacteria. And through that surface injection, we can inject directly into the cement sheath. And because of that delayed time frame before the deposition process begins, can achieve a significant depth of penetration on the order of hundreds to the low thousands of feet into the cement sheath before the seal is created, effectively creating a seal down hole, but leaving that pathway open above for any residual venting of trapped pressure to surface. So biomineralization fluids are applied in stages. So multiple injections are conducted so that the bacteria can coat the walls of the pathway, begin the deposition process, and build up the calcium carbonate on the walls of that pathway until effectively sealing off the pathway. This occurs over multiple days, and as I mentioned earlier, occurs well below a 1 gallon per minute injection rate. So here on the first day, we can see working our way up to a constant pressure, or the maximum injection pressure for this treatment, at 700 psi. The injection rate began at a 0.09 gallon per minute rate, and as that pathway becomes fully saturated and the sealing process continues, you can see the decrease in injection rate at a constant pressure. At some point, we replenish fresh bacteria and biomineralization fluid to the end of that tubing string and begin a second stage of injection. Maybe from day 1 to day 2, we can see that decrease in injection rate, which is the indicator of the sealing process taking place. And through subsequent injections, we see continued decrease in injection rate. Here in the middle of day 3, we see a small step up in injection rate, which we interpret as a breakthrough into a new pathway and self-diversion of the fluid system. We continue the process until we fall consistently below a 0.01 gallon per minute injection rate, at which point we call the pathway effectively sealed. After this point, we recommend a monitoring period for any residual gas to work its way out of the pathways behind casing, express its surface, and then ultimately fall off and die. I do have one case history I'd like to share with the group. This is our first orphan well that we plugged. This was just outside of Cleveland, Ohio. This well was actually drilled prior to World War II, and all of the casing strings were removed as part of the scrap effort during the war. The state regulator that was overseeing this work came in, did some diagnostics on the status of the hole. Ultimately, they installed a casing string so that they could reach the obtainable bottom of this well. They cemented the casing string in place and started setting cement plugs up to the shoe of that casing string. At that point, they noticed there was significant bubbling on the outside of the 7-inch string that was set in the well. That's when we became involved in the process and identified this as a good candidate for our DPAS system, which is our deep penetrating annular squeeze, which can be applied from surface. That gave them the confidence to continue setting cement plugs inside of the 7-inch string so that they could finish up with the rig, move the rig to the next location, continue on with their program on time. And then we came in after the rig, tied on to the well, which you can see is in an urban environment. And we injected over the course of 2 days directly into the cement sheath at surface at 1,460 PSI. Initial injection rates were started off at 0.188 gallon per minute, and over the course of 2 days dropped to 0.006 gallon per minute. And the bubbles expressing at surface on the first day, TMTC stands for too many to count. So just a visual indication of the bubbling that we were seeing. And then after the completion on the last day, we saw 0 bubbles returning to surface over the course of 10 minutes. This well was effectively cut off, capped, and the landowner's backyard restored to its original state. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Oops. Sorry, just coming back online. Okay, thank you, Bryce. Jim, we'll go to you now.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I do not have a presentation. I just have some notes that I would like to speak to and kind of transition into finishing up with Andrew, if that's okay.
Yep, that sounds good.
Okie dokie. Well, first off, I want to go back to Robin and the MICP work for a minute and talk a little bit about that. First off, this work, as Robin showed, was a lot of people were involved. I think one thing that Robin may have left out, this work was done as part of a DOE program through the carbon storage program. And without their support, we would have never been able to do that along with the Southern Company. We had great DOE partners and program managers throughout this effort. And the reason I want to plug that is, as you all know, right now, there's a lot of good work that's not happening because of a lot of things going on right now with the Department of Energy. And I just think sometimes the work that the Department of Energy supports doesn't get all the credit that it needs to get, because we wouldn't be here with MICP now at as a commercial business line without the support that we got back early on in the project. The MICP work, I think, shows, and Bryce mentioned it, one of the things that I learned years ago very early is on squeeze cement, that squeeze pressure does not necessarily relate to seal. And I'm glad that shell paper kind of pointed that out, because I think one of the reasons that cement squeezing is sometimes not very successful is people overestimate the pressure to which they think they need to apply squeeze pressure. It's successful squeezing, be they MICP or cement or resin or whatever, just is really all about getting the material into the right place. And so I was kind of pleased to see that note out of that paper, that shell paper, that they kind of came to realization. It's something I did kind of early in my career, that squeeze pressure is not a measure of success. The other thing on the MICP, before I kind of drift off into some other things I wanted to mention today, is the big breakthrough that I think we had with MICP, and Robin, feel free to speak up and correct me if you disagree, but as you saw the process when we started down in Alabama, on those wells, it was really laborious. I mean, it was uh, personnel intensive. It was slow. We had to work really hard to do that. But after we got the lab trailer built and we put our heads together, when we went up to Indiana and started working on the well where we were sealing the thief zone, uh, we came up with a new placement technique that actually made the whole, I think, the MICP process successful in that we were able to continuously inject the material. We did not have to shut down and let the microbes grow and then separate, a very detailed separation of microbes and fertilization material. And so developing that placement technique is, I think, very important in that it made this a lot more of an efficient process. Now we had something that we could actually go talk to clients and well owners about that might not be so people intensive, might not require so many people on location. And that's a big advantage, in my opinion, of the BioSqueeze business model is that your footprint on location to perform these treatments is very small. Uh, as the one picture showed in an urban environment, they were able to go in there. If you're doing cement squeezing, you've got big cement pumping equipment, you've got big cement bulk hauling material equipment. So the footprint for the biomineralization process is very small, which makes it great for going back to orphan wells or sometimes wells that are discovered after a property owner even has already built their home. So I think that's also a really big advantage that the biomineralization process brings to the table. Also, the injection rates for biomineralization are so low that you don't have to have really big pumping equipment. As a matter of fact, our biggest challenge when we first started doing the experiment was to try to find pumping equipment that could pump a rate low enough because we were injecting into such small apertures that it required a really, really low rate. And then we had to find some flow measurement that could actually also measure rates that low because it was much below what would be normally used in oil field applications. So that's kind of all I have to say about biomineralization. I think the two fellows before me did a much better job than I have. But I just wanted to talk generally. I've spent a lot of my career in wellbore integrity, both trying to establish it and understanding it and analyzing it. And for the last many years, most of my work has been in carbon sequestration, and we put a lot more focus in CCS on wellbore integrity than typical oil and gas operations. But one of the things that I just wanted to mention as just a general discussion topic today is, why are these wells leaking? Why are the orphan wells leaking? And we've seen some slides that, show cement failure and things like that. But I think it's also it goes to even a bigger process. It's, if it's the older wells in Pennsylvania before there were, cemented casing, that's one thing. But for wells that were drilled, in the 50s, so post World War II on to the present, a lot of those wells are leaking because the plugging practices were so poor. Not many plugs were set. They may or may not have been set in the right places. One of the guidelines was always across any permeable zones. But what defines a permeable zone? Maybe what defined a permeable zone in 1960, as we know now, is not the same thing as a permeable zone today. And so I think a lot of times plugs were not set around hydrocarbon bearing formations. And so there was a big underestimation of just how much methane you could produce out of very low permeability zones. And then the other reason is the primary cementing practices themselves that we have to take a hard look at. In the CCS world, all of our strings of casing are cemented to surface. That's part of the regulations and the procedures. Typical oil and gas wells are not cemented that way. They're cemented to where the zones of interest are covered, and there may be large gaps of the cement from between strings of casing. There's a lot of formations that are left open, and some of these formations, as we know now, are hydrocarbon bearing, even though they might not be hydrocarbon bearing from a commercial point of view. They will produce enough hydrocarbon to become a problem. And then I think back to the cement placement too. It goes back to that same thing. Are we covering all of the zones that need to be covered in modern, even today in cement practices? I'm worried that today, with a lot of the focus on the high rate fracturing and the current cementing practices on a lot of wells, that we're just creating the orphan leakage wells of the next generation, not. And so I think some of the things that we learned from going back and analyzing why these wells are leaking and what is the source of the methane that is being leaked in the atmosphere, we kind of need to take some of those lessons and apply them to modern practices, and so that we don't create a bunch of orphan wells for tomorrow. But anyway, those were the notes that I had taken, and a few things that I just wanted to discuss today. And I don't want to take up any more time, but want to pass this on to Andrew, which I'm sure has some good insights, and then we can have a discussion after Andrew finishes. So again, thank you very much for having me on the panel, and I'll pass it on. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Much appreciated. Andrew, we'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. All right. Let me get my slides going and then I will talk. Let me see here. I am great at this. I promise as soon as I figure out where the button is, it lets me share. So, all right, we're getting there. Did I do that? There. All right. Hopefully you're starting to see my screen, and then I get my slides going and you'll see the right thing. All right. So I owe you an apology to start with, because I'm not a new technologies guy. I'm a well integrity guy. So Jim kind of teed me up, which I didn't expect. So thank you, Jim. So instead of like trying to go pull some things together that I kind of don't know about, I've decided to go with my strengths. I did help with a little bit of the biomineralization stuff, but mostly cutting the well apart, not trying to put it together. And I've done a little bit of stuff on thermite in the past, which is interesting, but again, not my area of expertise. So what I did want to do is walk through the stuff that I see that these technologies need to be used for. And you may have had this yesterday, and I only have about 4 slides. But you kind of, and Jim kind of teed this up. A typical abandoned well, not a CCS well or some kind of specialized well, has effectively cement at the bottom and cement at the top and not cement in between. It is a really simple way to put it. And that leads to a lot of areas where fluids can leak between zones or make their way to the surface. That said, so this is just a section of the previous well, and in here we've included a plug. But you can kind of summarize leakage as in stuff leaks through the cement or stuff leaks around the cement. I mean, it is really that simple. You can dig a lot deeper into it. Cement itself is really impermeable. So through the cement is not typically a big deal unless there's something wrong with your cement. But around the cement is, and a lot of the things we've been talking about on this biomineralization stuff is designed to plug things that are trying to move around the cement. And one of the previous 2 sets of slides had an image like this, where the wellbore is that white open circle here, and then that red might represent casing, and then you've got cement and then rock. And the thing to point out here is that this is off-center. And when you get something off-center, we call it east-centered.
you can end up with mud on one side of the casing. You can have poorly placed cement. And that can lead to a leakage pathway. In addition, if you don't design your cement right, you may have gas migration while your cement is setting, which is also a leakage pathway. And then operating the well can cause its own leakage pathway through cracks, through thermomechanical cracks. You could create microannuli, which could be created during cementing or operations. But all of these are ways that you go around the cement. So the thing I think that has to be kept in mind when these technologies are coming online is how do I get this plugging technology or well remediation technology to follow the same pathways. And I wanted just a little bit to show how we see these pathways, because some of them you really can't see. It was interesting, and I wasn't on yesterday because I was on an airplane the entirety of the day, to hear that an estimate of 40% of wells have defects, because I would estimate that at 100% of wells have defects. But some of those defects aren't deal breakers, and often that's the case. You will find a defect somewhere in your well, and hopefully that defect isn't something you have to go fix, but you will find something everywhere. What you're looking at here are a couple different kinds of cement logs. But in particular, this track that's second to the left here, this wood grain pattern is an indication that a well was eccentered. The casing was eccentered when this was cemented. So you're actually seeing formation returns that's causing that wood grain pattern as opposed to reading cement. So even though from a simple point of view, my solid liquid gas map here is telling me you are all solid, this track is telling me that I might have a problem. And so my research in the past has been cutting up wells in the field, and doing other tests. And I'm going to get to a couple of pictures of things that were recovered from wells to kind of show what we're dealing with firsthand. But the other thing that can happen, and I mentioned that, if your cement is good, you won't go around it. But this was some work we did in 2013 where we pressured up a well that we'd perforated. And what was reading is solid cement. So over here, if you can see my cursor, where you've got this green and green through brown to black. Schlumberger or another service company, and I was Schlumberger when we did this, would tell you that is all solid cement. And we pressured up. We were going to run an interference test, and lo and behold, a lot of that green stuff disappeared, meaning it wasn't solid. So even though the log indicated we had something solid there, it wasn't. So interpretation of what you have behind casing is going to be as big a challenge as figuring out how to put the remedial technology there and what that remedial technology should be. I think this is my last slide beyond one that says thank you. And let me minimize so I can see there we go. So what you're looking at here, and these were in wells, these were just oil and gas wells that we sidewall cored in Wyoming in, approximately 2010. For scale, everything here is an inch in diameter, so about the size, the diameter of a quarter. If everybody's familiar with a quarter, you're actually looking at a gas intrusion pathway in the upper left here. That is not something we can measure or see through the casing. The other two cores here, so you're looking at cement with a little bit of rock in it, so the well wasn't properly cleaned out or ready to cement. And then over here is more than just cement. So you've got steel, then you've got cement with a little bit of shale in it. So that, again, that well was not properly cleaned out before cementing. And then you've got rock. So this is actually more or less what you want to see. We don't typically find rock in our cement. Well, actually, I guess I can't say that. I've only done it a few times. Probably don't, but maybe we do. But this is what you would expect to see, about an inch of cement between the casing and the formation. Similar, whoops, sorry, move the two fingers instead of one. What you're looking at here is a very thin cement down here in the bottom left, and then a lot of rock that we collected. So what this means is this well was centered, and that's fine because I still have solid cement up against rock. However, if I move over to the last core I'll talk about here on the bottom right, I'm looking at casing, about an inch of cement, about a quarter inch of drilling mud, and then rock. And drilling mud not being removed from the well. This is, I mentioned at the beginning, you can have a kind of a layer. The thought at the time when we wrote that first slide that it would be a thin layer, not a thick layer. But drilling mud is going to be potentially somewhat problematic because it's still going to take up space. So something that you try to pump through there, it may not push that out of the way, and you still may get some kind of leakage pathway in that area. But I thought it was worth showing the visuals of what these look like. I apologize that I said yes before I realized what I was saying yes to, but I'm fairly confident that I can be part of this conversation and give some insight. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, a lot of great information here. I'm guessing we're going to have people that want to get into questions. So let me see if let me give the committee a chance. And we did have, I'll tell you what, while the committee's thinking about some ideas, we'll go, okay, I'll go to Maleva, and then we do have one audience question, but let me go to Maleva first here.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. This was like what I've been waiting for. It's a topic that I'm very passionate and care about. So, question for, I guess, all the biomineralization presenters is on how sensitive this biomineralization is to the chemistry of the fluids in the formation and in the area where they're being placed. And then the second, have there been any tests on the chemical stability of these carbonates that form calcites in this case? Because we know that from the earlier presentation today from Nick from USGS, some of these orphan well areas are going to be very corrosive environments. And this would be like limestone or any other carbonate rock that does not do very well in low pH. And then I'll have a question for Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I can share a little bit of work with you that we did, and Jim can chime in on the field work that we did where we actually acidified brine around a well and then did the placement, and I kind of skipped over that, but and we were able to perform the biomineralization. It was successful. So you can do it because ultimately you replace some of the fluids, right, when you inject, and the ureolysis occurs and you start having calcium carbonate precipitation. So this can be done. Regarding the stability, of course, that's always hard to evaluate, really, to do any work on geologic timescales. But what I can tell you is that we did some comparative work between MICP, so microbially induced calcium carbonate precipitation, so the calcite produced by microbes, and basically synthetic calcite, and the dissolution rates of the MICP produced calcite were lower, significantly lower than the synthetic calcite. And that's one of the things that I can tell you, but I will pass it on to others with respect to oil field and relevance of this. That's outside of my area of expertise.
Great, thank you, Robin. So Andrew, I'm really glad you brought two topics that I think often missed, and that is this decentralization. It applies not to primary cement, but also to plugs. I've seen some cutouts from Shell study, where the outer annual space has no cement at all. So if you were to, pick how to solve that problem, and what would you do in that scenario? And also, from your Schlumberger days, and then this is for others. Do we have, are there any new solutions on how to identify where these problems are, how to locate them, how to know where to go with whether biosqueeze or any other solution?
Well, okay, yeah. And Jim, feel free to pipe in as well. So our biggest sort of tool is planning. There aren't radically different technologies now, I think, than there were years ago when some of these wells were getting constructed. But I think the difference, and Jim kind of pointed it out when it comes to like CCS versus oil and gas, is taking the time and doing the work and putting it's spending a little bit more money. It's centralizing the well. It's making sure that you're not in such a hurry that you get out of the well and never go back and make sure that the cement has actually, hydrated. So you've got hard cement. Stuff like that is key. And then it's again around spending the money. If kind of all wells have some defects, it's putting in enough of the material that you can have a defect somewhere that doesn't affect the overall objective of what you're doing. So if I need to put in a lot more cement to make sure I'm cemented somewhere, put in a lot more cement. As far as measuring these defects, I think tools and processing are getting consistently better. Even within my career, we've been able to see go from seeing the cement and the casing to cement casing and formation with ultrasonic tools, and that's around processing. The ultrasonic wave hasn't really changed. It's people figuring out how to look at this stuff. I think that will continue to grow. Jim, you've done a lot more of the cementing side of this than I ever will. If you want to comment on that stuff.
Well, I just want to kind of add to what you're saying. First off, on heard the numbers about how many wells have cementing defects, and like Andrew said, probably every well has a cementing defect or several, but it's whether or not it involves having the seal. But there's things like centralization, for one, that really we've known about centralization for a long time, but people, there's old wives' tale. I can't put centralizers on, my casing will get stuck, or la da da da. It takes time to put centralizers on. All the major service companies now have really good wellbore simulators and really good predictive tools on taking the wellbore trajectory and helping to design the correct centralization process. And so just not using those tools is one of the big reasons we have a lot of cement failures. The other thing is when you look at all those failures, they all go to one, mostly. I mean, you can have mechanical breakdown while you're executing the job. You can have catastrophic things like that happen. But when you really break it down, mud removal is the cause of cementing failures or incomplete mud removal. And so, tuning your spacers to where your viscosities are such that you can remove the mud ahead of the cement, centralization, all of those things are tools for mud removal. And the lack of mud removal is what contributes to almost all of the cement imperfections. And then the last thing, and this one just gets me absolutely wadded up because it happens so often, is think about what you're doing. And I've seen wells that the cement placement was, perfect. But for whatever reason, they either decided to land the casing, so they started pulling and stretching and moving the casing, or they performed the pressure test to 80% of the casing capacity while the cement was in transition. when the cement is in transition, it needs to be left alone until it takes its set. And I don't know how many times you see wells that probably would have had a really good cement job, but now they have a microannulus because somebody wanted to save 3 or 4 hours and they went ahead and did a pressure test while the cement was going through its transition. And once you move that cement during that phase, it's not coming back. It's not going to come back against the casing. You're going to have that gap. And that's why you see so many of the use at logs. What shows up as gas is really air-filled microannuli, and that's why you see a lot of those. That's how they get formed. So anyway, those were a couple of comments on just why some things like that happen. Some of them are just in such a hurry, you know.
Thank you. This actually really lines up nicely with what George King said yesterday. If there was one thing that he would like to see change, and that's more training for the field people who do these jobs, so that we avoid these kind of scenarios you mentioned. Thank you, everyone. Excellent.
Okay, thanks. Eilish?
Hi, yeah, I'm Eilish. I didn't mention before. I am with DOE from the National Energy Technology Lab. So we're primarily focused on research at our lab. I did have a quick question about the maximum fracture or void size that could be filled with biosqueeze or biomineralization. Have you done testing on that?
Bioship, we target filling pathways anywhere that from submicron up to approximately 10 millimeters. So very hard to be able to differentiate that based off of the logging technology, similar to what Andrew shared or conventional radial CBLs. But using an injection test that will help us gauge the relative size of that pathway and determine if it's a good biosqueeze candidate or if placing full cement or microfine cement might be a better option.
I think we had spoken previously, but in another setting. I know there's certain aspects that need to be in place at the well to inject biosqueeze. Would you be able to go into a little bit of that? Just so we understand better, like where it would be applicable.
Yeah, thank you. And so I may have briefly touched on that in the presentation, but not shared enough detail. And that's around, we can apply biosqueeze in two different methods. One is a downhole squeeze targeted through the casing directly into the cement sheath, or down tubing directly into the top of a downhole cement plug. And that concept for a deeper source of gas that allows us to supplement the existing cement in situ. Sometimes a significant amount of work is performed downhole. Some diagnostics are done so that everyone involved is comfortable that the gas expression at surface is coming from a shallow source. And that's a position where we can inject directly at surface into the cement sheath, what we call our DPAS or deep penetrating annular squeeze. And we can delay the deposition of the bacteria by up to 2 hours. And we can inject from surface to seal off that pathway, and the seal will be created down hole, even though the fluid's being injected from surface.
Do I have time to ask a few more questions, or do you want to move on?
Why don't we circle through everybody and come back around to you, Eilish, okay? Jeff?
Hello. Hi, Jim. Nice to see you again. And everybody else that I seem I've worked with many of you through the years. One question I have on the biomineralization, and something that I'm seeing a lot of recently, Jim, and others, is corrosion effects that are just more accelerated than they have been in the past, likely due to previous conversations we've had on presenters to the committee. Is just what we're doing in produced water injection and everything else, it's kind of changed the landscape. We're seeing failures way early, not in abandonment, but way, way early. Is there the ability, I know we focus on calcite and calcium carbonate, is there ability for another material besides calcium carbonate to be formed with this biomineralization, something that may be less prone to maybe some of the pH or CO2 driven corrosion effects or scaling effects that calcium carbonate can have? Have y'all looked into that? Maybe some magnesium-based byproducts or something like that?
Yes, I'm gonna answer this, but not without re-emphasizing what Jim said earlier. Thank you, DOE. I did have him on there, but I didn't explicitly express this. Without the Department of Energy and about 10 years worth of funding, this would have not happened in multiple competitive rounds. So we are really, really thankful also for the access to the Gorgas power plant that well. And again, with many other people involved, this would have not happened. And we did have some time to look at other minerals, and we are still playing around with it, and there are ways of precipitating other minerals. What I am never sure about is what is a better mineral. What is a magnesium carbonate truly more, or a calcium magnesium carbonate dolomite truly more resistant to dissolution than calcite? Is a phosphate truly more resistant? Is a silicate truly more resistant? I don't know that, certainly not in the long term. And the one thing that really encouraged me, and this was one of the review meetings that Nettle put on for these projects, I talked to a number of oil field folks from Shell and Chevron and so on and so forth, and they all said we are comfortable with calcium carbonate based seals based on our experience with them because they're reservoir seals that we trust. Now, I'm not an oil field person, but that is what I carried home. And yeah, we can produce other minerals, either biologically or otherwise, but unless I hear that there is a specific mineral that somebody would like to produce, or I see a big advantage, it takes a lot of work to figure out how to do this in an engineered manner. As Bryce pointed out, we have a really good control over uriolysis, when, at what rate, and where it happens. And this would be quite a bit of work to do this. It's not impossible. So that's my 2 cents worth, if that much.
Oh, thank you.
David Perrin.
Hey, thanks, everyone. It's been a very good discussion. My name is David Perrin. I'm a well P&A advisor for Chevron, and I know we have used bio-squeeze quite a bit on some land wells, mostly in Colorado. And my question would be, obviously it's gaining traction and more deployment, and to look at it as a rapid deployment or scalability. I think a lot of it you touched on, you need the right candidate and candidate well for it. And to do that, you need data and information. And a lot of times we use noise, acoustic logs to understand, pinpoint where the leak is. And I think that goes to, are you doing a deep squeeze application or up at the surface? And that comes with a cost too. So maybe just some thoughts on, especially if this was to be recommended to the orphan well program in the States, knowing that every dollar counts, but understand the bang for the buck. And how necessary are some of those logs, and what can we maybe do from a government industry partnership to maybe bring down costs to make this more economically viable for everyone too.
Yeah, David, I think that's a great question, right? Because this really is addressing how do we deal with this at a scale that's really going to make a dent in the overall problem, right? When it comes to diagnostics, yes, they come at a significant cost. That's typically not something an orphan well program wants to include in their scope of work. So we rely on the orphan well programs to have a very good handle on their local geology. And we typically see they have the depth of knowledge and within their group. They'll have geologists on staff, have some of the drilling records that are accessible from development work that was done prior in those areas that they're working in. And that basis of knowledge, along with expertise on location, helps really pinpoint when was bubbling noted in the plugging process. What zones do we think are potentially causing these issues? And then that allows for decision making to be made hopefully ahead of the start of the project, but sometimes dealing with issues as they arise during execution. So with all of that information coming together, as we kind of envision a broader sense of dealing with orphan wells, I think with the tools that are available now, our recommendation is move forward with using cement, right? It's readily available. And until we find an overall better tool in the market that fits the budget that's been allocated for doing work like this, cement the well off, just similar to the example that we showed. And then biomineralization is available if that issue is noticed downhole and it persists, or if that issue is noticed at surface and you're comfortable it's from a shallow source, then that gives the orphan well group the ability to do the intervention at the right time. So use cement where it fits, and when you experience a failure, now there's another tool available to be able to supplement the cement that's already been placed in them.
No, okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, thanks. Nathan?
Sure, I've got a couple of quick ones. Jim, you mentioned several things that were related to improving cement jobs and, uh, centralization and spacers and this, that, and the other. The one you didn't mention is the one that they beat on me to use when I was a much younger man, and that's moving pipe while you're pumping the job. Passing collars, rotating. Is that does anyone do that anymore? I just had a really good experience in some wells early on that had very poor cement jobs. Well before those, were anywhere close to setting, of actually moving that pipe, and that seemed to solve the mud problem much better than spacers, and certainly much cheaper.
No, I think that, moving casing where you can is still applicable. I think casing movement during cementing came long before, spacer technology and chemistry and other things. And it was one of the earliest and very effective methods of mud removal, because the whole thing, as I said earlier, is about mud removal. And so while you don't necessarily maybe see it as much anymore, is probably due to the fact that the spacer systems that are employed today are so much better than and more effective than they've been in the past. And then it seems, and I don't understand why, except maybe as wells have gotten deeper and it becomes more and more difficult to actually move casing, that why it's not used. And then also knowing when to move the casing, as far as at what point during the cement operation is also something that has to be taken into effect. But yeah, I actually spent some time where we actually rotated casing while cementing, and that was really hard to do, and took a lot of specialized equipment. And so I think the answer to your question is you need to support anything that you can possibly do that to assist in mud removal. And if you can work your casing string, then it should be done.
Well, if you ask a driller, the answer is no. You cannot, because once
Right.
it's down there, they do not want to move it. Didn't want to move it in the 70s, don't want to move it today. And I just think that in terms of the centralization problem, the eccentric pipe, all that is addressed in terms of mud movement. The other thing, of course, on pressurization, you might not always know when the cement is set unless you make temperature measurements. Then you know exactly. You've got it's hard to estimate and easy to measure. The question I had on the MICP was related to there's a fairly presumably complex network of cracks of different widths that may have developed, some microannular, some cracks in pipe. We saw all these different things, and they have different capillary pressures and presumably even different wettabilities if oil has flown, been going through them for any distance. Are there any tools to actually measure that, and does that affect your design at all? I'm just thinking that if I was to pump in and watch pressure fall off or flow back in a pressure transient sense, I could get some idea of this, distribution and what I'm connected to that might inform the size and rates for the job. Maybe that's more complicated than it needs to be, but it seems like there's probably some information there that you could measure in advance for that design. I don't know if anyone's doing that.
Yeah. Nathan, really good question, right? It is interesting as that is, and we are continuing to look into the ability to perform a pressure transient analysis or some level of diagnostic injection tests at multiple rates. We're still not there yet, and one of those components is because of rig time, right? If we're doing a downhole injection, typically the largest single cost item on location is the workover rig. So, it comes back to, will that information fundamentally change the injection that we're going to do? With the fact that the fluid becomes self-diverting, as we begin our injections with the biomineralization fluid, we have the ability to adjust our formulation based off of the initial injections that we're seeing. We can change our fluid systems. If we think we're injecting into a sub-micron size pathway or all the way up to the 10 millimeter size pathway, we can modify how we're pumping that job on the fly in the early stages. And then as those pathways begin to restrict and seal off, then we have the ability to continue to evolve that design and adapt to the pressure and injection regime that we're seeing as we move into the final stages of sealing.
I'm almost wondering if there is some information you can do real time with the injected pressures and rates, but I guess that solution with analytically is going to be fairly complicated. I don't remember anybody doing that. So
I think there's definitely potential for additional work to be done in this space. And the nice thing is we're capturing all of our information digitally. So look forward to doing a deeper dive on that at some point in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. I'll tell you what, let me just pose a question from the audience that came in, and then we'll go back around to the committee. And this is posed by and forgive me if I don't have the name right, Bart Jopi from the Baker Hughes Well Abandonment Leader, who's in the audience, and he said, is there enough focus on where to place the permanent seals in the wellbore? And he notes that that he's heard everything from filling the entire wellbore to placing barriers inside the reservoir. Neither appear effective, possibly, and elsewhere in the world, the focus is on resealing the caprock or geological confining zones, similar to uh, class 4 wells, or I assume that class 6 wells for CCS in the USA. So a little bit of a answer conversation on placement of plugs versus kind of sealing the reservoir. And we had another question on sealing the reservoir as well. So any thoughts, input?
Yeah, because I'm a CCS guy, I get this question actually a lot. And there's no solid 100% answer here. I think, making sure that you get seals through the formations that are your traps, or if you're CCS, or your cap rocks, is going to be key. Sealing up a reservoir that has fluid moving everywhere else but the cement plug that I just put in it isn't going to keep things from sort of moving up if I don't get it sealed through that stratigraphic seal, the geologic seal. That said, sometimes when you're placing cement, it might be worth having some cement in that zone, so you're building on something instead of starting off in that cap rock. But it's a tricky problem. A lot of times people just lean on, some is good, more is better. So they lean towards filling the hole. So I don't know, Jim, if you have anything you want to add to that.
No, I think it's a really good question, and it kind of touched on something I mentioned is, are you setting the plugs in the right places? Do we always know for sure that we're setting the plugs where they belong? And again, one thing that comes up a lot in well plugging, and it goes back to economics, is how often do we verify that the plug is in fact where we thought it was when we set it? And that's something that, again, it varies place by place and by regulation, but a lot of plugs are placed, but then there's no verification that the plug stayed where he placed it. And so that comes into play as well. So.
Thanks. We'll go to background to the committee, and Jeff, you round two.
Round two, I guess. No, I was really just gonna touch on Nate's question about rotation, give kind of a state on that and a comment on that. I would say around 50% of primary semen jobs today, we start off with rotation today. And we got widely utilized semen heads to do that, or you can, depend upon the basin and configuration, you can do top drive driven cement jobs. But it's a 2-mile lateral or less proposition. And that's why you see a decrease and it's just not done. It's just we over torque the connections after that length of well. So it becomes a money discussion yet again. Everything seems to go back to that dollar sign at the end of the day. Either trying to move faster and all that damage is trying to save money, or just be the quicker because we like to be quick, and or the connections are themselves are just too expensive. But rotation has proven to be very effective where we can do it and should be done. It's always my recommendations, like Jim said. However, for well abandonment plug placement, I mean, you're in a little bit of a different environment and how we're setting these things. So from a primary, fixing the problem before it's a problem, centralization and mud removal is the Achilles heel, like Jim said. And I think rotation can, but we over torque during the cement jobs. But the weird thing, Andrew, you look at a lot of USITs and IBCs, and I can actually draw a line where we stop rotating. That's how clear the difference is on the cement quality before and after rotation is stopped. It's a direct line that correlates to the time they torqued out. and could no longer rotate. And we've seen this over and over on lateral logs. So it's very good, Nate. Then it's just nobody wants to do it, and it costs a lot of money.
Well, I think one thing on that too, Jeff, is you mentioned the advent of the top drive rig has probably made that a lot easier too than having to use those old rotation tools that used to be in place. So I think on rotating, it's gotten easier over the years to do. So.
Okay. Ilis?
Yeah, so maybe for the whole group, but I'm mostly thinking Andrew might be able to answer this best. But I've been working with the University of Pittsburgh, and we've been looking at like gas migration through well cements during the setting time. And I know Jim mentioned the transition time, and I think typically that's determined with the static gel strength. Some of the testing we're doing, it's showing that transition time is actually happening much later than what's predicted with the static gel strength. So I do wonder if that potentially, could help if we understand better the transit, like when the cement is actually gas tight. And then, so Andrew, specifically for you, I was wondering if you've seen evidence of, gas channeling that or foaming. And I've seen cores from Pennsylvania wells where, they brought that up, and it was, seen in well completions, but I think it could potentially be, just as much of an issue for plugging wells, because we're told anecdotally it happens in the shallow sections of the well. So typically the well depths that we're interested in plugging. So just wondering if you've seen anything, any evidence of that.
I haven't. My little picture is the only thing I've ever brought up from the bottom of a well that had it, and I was thrilled to have my little sample. That said, we are constructing a lot of wells on the CCS side right now, and what we are being told by the service companies will be our setting times, and what we are finding in the field are often radically different. And that has to do, I think, with somewhat last minute kinds of changes that are made when you actually get your blend versus what gets tested in the laboratory and the conditions that they get tested under. So I think making sure that you know the actual conditions of the well when you're going to be setting your cements is going to be key. And then if you do know them, making sure that that actually gets done in the laboratory properly so that you've got that match and you don't wind up in a problem where you've got that transition time at a different time than you expected is probably really important.
Yeah, it's a function of whether you have gas migration or not. It's a function of the pressure differentials. And so you do need to consider the overburden pressure, the formation gas pressure, and depth to estimate what your those different pressures would be, and then
Agreed.
looking at the slurry pressure. So yeah, I mean it's on an order of like maybe 15. So if you look at like equivalent age, so taking to normalize for temperature impacts on cement hydration, but it's typically, I mean, we're seeing like 12 to 15 hours when that part starts. And so that, what would be considered the critical static gel strength time up to, I mean, it could be 19 hours before it's gas tight.
Yeah.
Some cements, it's like 20 to 30 hours after, so of equivalent hydration age. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's in line with some of the issues we've been having. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I just want to butt in, and Jeff, this, you and I've had these discussions too. I think understanding, first off, and Nathan, you mentioned that too, knowledge of the temperature, estimating having a good handle on estimating circulating temperature, and then the cement behavior. And then thing that happens. All the service companies build in their own safety margins on thickening times and things like that. So I think we end up, in my opinion, we end up sometimes having longer transition times than what was predicted. Sometimes we create them ourselves, but other times we maybe just don't understand all the influence. But I think that's a really good point because I think that happens a lot. And Andrew, you mentioned that too. I just feel like that based on my experience that I think that happens a lot more often than we think it does. So.
Okay. Maleva, you have the last question.
Wow, great privilege. Thank you. Okay, so this goes across the board for all the speakers. There are a couple of things that we as a committee hope to address in this study. And one of those is what is needed in terms of this better match between lab and field data. In other words, what we need to do better in the lab to be able, and I think Andrew started kind of addressing this a little bit. And the second, also related to that, when we think about primary cementing and, you know, everything that we know about cement, it was really all the research and the testing was designed for the wellbore construction, not really for the P&A. We do probably need to bring here a component of time. So from your individual perspective, what kind of time frame are we looking in terms of, you know, P&A plugs for these orphaned wells? I'm not talking now like all P&A protocols, but like just for this particular study. Sorry, it's a long question. Thank you.
Any responses?
When you say what kind of time, you mean how long each plug, or what?
In terms of time, like, are we looking for
Yeah.
hundreds or thousands of years or infinity?
Oh, sorry. And I was thinking how long it takes to set up. Yeah. Gosh. I mean, I think that you would be doing a disservice to think that anything past tens of years is something we can really measure or estimate. But that said, you know, if I mean, those are materials that we just don't have a longer history with, but you know, thousands of years seems kind of reasonable. I don't know. Does anybody else have thoughts on this?
Well, and not knowing much about this at all, right? Putting my engineering hat on for a moment. If you design something that you don't know how long it lasts, because the conditions can be different, you want to design it in a way that you can modify and improve it over time, which requires monitoring, right? If there's a leak, you got to go back in. I mean, not everything is perfect, right? So, again, not knowing anything about, well, I shouldn't say anything, but very little about plugging and abandonment. You know, that's probably what you got to do. You got to think about how can I go in 10 years, 50 years and reseal it, improve it. I mean, I'm going to throw the ball at Jim.
Well, you know, cement's been around a long time, and we have hundreds of years of cement, thousands maybe, and but so I'm not sure it would be the degradation of the cement itself. Talking generally about, you know, plugging, but again, back to placement of the plugs, and that is something we can affect, and you know, making sure we set enough plug, and that's something, you know, where you set plugs sometimes years ago with kickoff plugs. And that was always the big deal, is knowing how much of a plug to set, because you know that your part of your plug, the first interface, is not going to be as strong as the very center of the plug. And so you can look at plug to abandon in the same sense. When you place a plug by the plug spotting method, you have a risk that there's going to be some mud contamination in certain places or parts of the plug. I think setting enough plug is probably the first off. The one thing that we have the biggest control over is don't try to get by with some, tiny amount of plug. I always get a kick out of people wanting to set like a 35 sack plug at a well. Well, when you look at modern cementing equipment, that's really pretty hard to do, even today, where the equipment's a lot better than it was years ago. So making sure you set enough plug is probably the one thing that I would say that for plugging these wells that would be the one thing you have control over today that could make a big difference in things, is making sure you set enough plugs.
Okay.
Thank you. That's definitely positive, something that can be done.
Yeah.
Well,
and in the big picture doesn't add a whole lot of incremental costs, because the cost is getting the equipment there and all that, and an additional 30, 40 sacks of cement is pretty small when you look at the big picture. So.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. So, Robin, Bryce, Jim, and Andrew, very much appreciate your time today. And committee the committee thanks you, appreciate it. We may be back in touch, and I'll turn this over to Noel for the wrap up.
All right. I will just echo your thank yous, Jim. Myself and my colleagues, Cameron Oskvig, Samuel Kraft, and all of our committee members threw this meeting together pretty quickly. And so we're really thankful that all of you were able to join us, and really lucky to have you all in the room, and the virtual room, so to speak. And I'm sure that we will be in touch in the future. So again, just thank you so much. It was really great to hear all of you speak today. And with that, I'll let you all go. And thank you for our audience members as well for sticking around on a Friday afternoon with us. Much appreciated.